Blues will take over, first and 10 on their own 20.
Strike up the band, and when you hear the band playing, you know that it's college. That college football season is right around the corner. And look, it was a long intro, guys, but this show has been a long time coming. I'm welcoming in my good college fantasy football buddy, Mike Bainbridge. Mike, glad to have you in here on the show. You and I have been talking now for a long time, been buddies with this in the college fantasy football world forever. We've always kind of talked about doing something together, collaborating, some type of joint project. And it's been a long time coming, but we're finally here. Welcome on, my friend. Glad to be talking to you.
Hey, glad to be here as well. It's sunny out. I have a high noon, drinking a high noon during this call, and we're about to talk some college fantasy football, so can't get much better than that.
No, man, look, and that's what I was, you and I have been talking, what a lot of people out there won't know, and we'll go into details of what we've been doing over the summer and throughout the spring, is that really over the last several years, for as long as we've been doing this, you and I have always been in contact with one another, stay in touch. We're always corresponding throughout the season. We're always asking each other, man, did you have a chance to check out my rankings? Did you have a chance to check out mine? And sometimes we're like, no, man, we just haven't had a chance yet. There's so much that you and I have going on, and it's finally good that you and I can hook up together. I'm sure this show, because we didn't announce it, is going to be somewhat of a surprise for many of those folks out there in the college fantasy football world. But let's finally get a chance to do this. But you and I have talked for quite some time about doing some things together.
Yeah, hopefully people don't have under the impression that we're competitors and we have this sort of battle between each other. No, we've been friends for a long time. It's good to interact with each other, just discussing kind of what we're doing, what we can improve on for upcoming future seasons. And so it's, again, good to collaborate with this call here.
I think the one thing that you and I have always agreed upon is that the value in our differences is really the value in the services and our sites that we provide. You and I have been doing this now for a long time, and the fact that we have difference of opinion, and we're going to get into some of those guys tonight. Really, that's where a lot of our followers are going to be interested in hearing what we have to say. Those differences on certain players that when they look at your rankings and when they look at mine, they say, okay, Mike's got this guy here, Joe's got here. Let's maybe hear about why they do or why they rank them the way that they do. So before we get into that, Mike, man, just kind of give us a rundown. What have you been doing throughout the spring, the summer? What's going on with your Patreon page? Give everybody a rundown right now of what you're doing and what to expect throughout the summer leading up to the season, man.
Well, right now, since February, we've been in the midst of our 130 team previews. Those are going to be the life or death of me because I had those done. I had those done May 5th of last year, and we are just entering the Power 5 conferences. So we intend to get that out before the end of the season. We'll have my rankings are available currently. My updated rankings that I published last month. My associate and partner, Zach Hall, is currently working on his rankings right now, so those should be posted within the next week or so. And we're just constantly churning out content that people can dive into leading up to the season.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for sharing that. The one thing that I will let all of my followers, everyone that listens to the show that maybe, who are maybe seeing you for the first time in association with doing something that I'm doing, I'm sure most people in the college fantasy football world are already familiar with you. But your year-round material is just rock solid, man. I know that you're still doing team previews and trying to finishing up those the rankings that you do. I mean, everything that you've done has always been top notch. That's why you and I have always wanted to kind of do something together. So if you're not following Mike and really supporting his Patreon page with college fantasy football, you really need to. He's an excellent resource for college fantasy football, and really I think what we do just kind of what we have over at the CFF site and what you're doing over there at Patreon, it really gives the entire college. I mean, I don't know if the college fantasy football community really needs any more than what we have. I mean, obviously, Mike, and everybody out there, we've got the preseason fantasy draft guide. We do projections. We do all of our in-season content, much like yourself as well. That preseason draft guide, I have it printed out. I told you before the show, I've got it handy, ready to go, because you and I write so much that sometimes we forget what we're even writing on some of the players. But in addition to those player rankings, that PDF, it's a 50-plus page document. It's got coaching changes in there. It's got recruiting rankings. It's got bye-week cheat sheets. It's got who's got some favorable, unfavorable schedules. If you like to stream defenses for the first 4 weeks of the season, we've got a little cheat sheet for you there. O-line, offensive line returning starters, you name it, it's all in there. And so, I think we've done enough to set up the show and what we actually have going on. So with that being said, Mike, we're going to go ahead and get into the rankings. We're just going to go position by position. We're going to spend some time at quarterback, running back, and receivers. And, the one thing that I'll do to kind of start it off before we get into the rankings is that, I said that the value in what we do really is our differences sometimes. So there will be some differences. And, Mike, I really respect what you do over there. I really love what you do. And the rankings that you do and what we put together over here, what I put together at the CFF site, we talk about it all the time. Our rankings are sort of the springboard for the college fantasy football community. You and I really put out some rankings early. And then you kind of see some iterations evolve throughout the spring and summer, different people releasing different rankings. And I do really believe that the rankings that you and I put out serve as sort of a springboard for everybody else to get their rankings out there. We see a lot of movement, though, throughout the spring without the summer. So let's just start off right there before we kind of get into specific rankings. Your take right now on what's going to happen. Maybe how is the lack of spring or spring cancellations around the country? How do you see that affecting a lot of what's going to happen for us in the fall, assuming we're going to have a season on time?
Two things stick out to me. One, the lack of freshmen in my rankings. I think at the quarterback position, we only have two freshman quarterbacks listed. I can't tell you offhand at the skill positions how many freshmen, but just the lack of spring for the early enrollees really hurts them trying to get they're involved in the playbook, obviously, and I'm sure they're in contact with our coaches via Zoom calls, how we are doing right now. But just getting onto the field, getting those reps in with the starters or the twos or whatever, I think that definitely will hurt their ability to get on the field early. And of course, there's some special situations, but I definitely think it hurts their ability to see the field as soon as maybe we've seen in the past. So again, like I said, I have two freshman quarterbacks right now. So again, I think special situations where they might show up, but yeah.
I've echoed that sentiment so far throughout the off season. I just think the lack of spring really hurts some of the guys that enrolled early, right, and get that spring session in. The summer, for the most part, the beginning of summer was shut down as we see players coming in. We're now in mid-June. The kids are just starting to come on campus, so it's going to be a little bit of a slow roll. And if you're looking at maybe a 6-week lead up to the season, a lot of those incoming freshmen that arrived early to participate in the spring just really are going to be a little bit behind the eight ball when it comes to getting on the field. And I think you're right. I think when it comes to the quarterback, you're probably going to see fewer true freshmen at that position than maybe some of the others, where they may be able to get them in for certain plays in the playbook or whatnot, and get those talented maybe freshman receivers and running backs on the field. Quarterback could be a different story. So
one other sorry to interject.
No. Go ahead, man.
One other point I wanted to add: the lack of spring probably didn't affect our rankings at the top very much, right? I think the starters, for the most part, are locked in at certain positions. So right at the top, I don't think the lack of spring hurt. It's where those sleepers that and those no-name players that haven't made an impact to this point, maybe those names would pop up in the spring that we are unaware of at this point. I think,
and that's an important point, because a drum that you and I beat over and over to a lot of our followers is that, not only do you win leagues in the draft, but you win leagues on the waiver wire too, right? So because the true freshmen are not going to be kind of showing their heads early on in the season, this could make our waiver wires a little rich as the season progresses. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's the beauty of college fantasy football for me, is that, the waiver wire is so extensive that you can make mistakes during the draft. Maybe you can't do that in NFL. I don't play NFL fantasy that much anymore, but you are afforded the opportunity to make some mistakes during the draft because the waiver wire is so extensive. And so, I mean, depending on how we do our jobs, hopefully the waiver wire isn't extensive, because we want to boast up the highest ranked players. So
yeah, you're right. One thing, and I say this all the time, college fantasy football is like the one fantasy league, or maybe the only one, where you can lose your first round player due to an injury and still have a shot to win the league because of the waiver wire. It's just, that's what makes college fantasy football so fun. It's not only unique, it's just different, right? It's different from NFL. It's different names almost each and every year. You've got attrition because of graduation, or players leave early to the NFL, and particularly the guys that play in full FBS formats. When you've got 130 teams, man, it's inevitable that we're going to get some waiver wire gems throughout the season. But yeah, but you said something in there that really is a nice segue to where we'll kind of kick things off for a lot of our folks with redrafts. Whereas if you make mistakes, or if you have a bad draft, you and I get a lot of emails all the time. We talk about this all the time. Sometimes our email inbox is just, we feel bad because we can't get to it fast enough sometimes. And a lot of those come in the preseason with draft strategies, right? There's a lot of emails that we get in regards to draft strategies. Hey, Joe. Hey, Mike, I've got the second pick of the draft. I've got the sixth pick in the draft. What should be my strategy? Why don't you go ahead and just kind of put that out there for us? Where do you view, what is your take on draft strategies, philosophies going into a draft, specifically redraft leagues?
I hope this doesn't make me sound bad as a CFF analyst, but I truly don't have a ton of strategy involved when it comes to drafting. I have my rankings, right? And we've done plenty of best ball drafts to this point, or a few. We've done we've held some mock drafts on our site. So we do see trends start to develop, right? The amount of depth at the running back position, the amount of depth at the quarterback position this year. We probably get into it when we discuss the wide receivers, how it's just been a run on wide receivers towards the end of the first round into the second and beyond. So from that aspect, yes, there's some strategy involved. But me, I have my rankings to my side. I let the board fall to me. It's kind of like the NFL draft where they say best player available. I choose the best player available. Now, a lot of it depends on the format that you're playing in. I will have a different strategy going in with a 4-point touchdown league, right? If touchdowns are 6 points from the quarterbacks, it's going to differ from different formats that you play in, right? Again, it's an evolvement. It's constantly evolving for me.
You and I are on the same page right there. The one thing that I'll do, I haven't really said this before, but I was thinking about this a lot. We run and crunch numbers so much. We look at data, we look at historical data with programs. When the emails come in regards to draft strategy, the one thing when I really think about it is that I believe that college fantasy football drafts is it's less of a science and more of an art. And I'll explain what I mean. You kind of, when you're going through a draft, it's not, let's be honest, if you have one of the top 3, 4, 5 picks, we know who we're probably going to get, right? But even after that, the draft's still got to come back to you, depending on how many rounds you play. You still have a lot of draft to go. And sometimes what you do is predicated on what happens or what are players that come off the board along the way. And I do think that college fantasy football drafts, and I really think fantasy drafts in general, I don't care if it's college fantasy football, fantasy, NFL fantasy football, fantasy basketball, I believe there is an art to a fantasy draft because you have to feel it. You have to see what's going on. You have to analyze it as you go. I don't think that's particularly a science. I think it's more of an art. And I think that's why in a lot of college fantasy football leagues, particularly a lot of our followers that are out there, there's really just a successful track record of them doing really well for college fantasy football. Yeah, they do hit the waiver wire and whatnot, but sometimes it's those guys that really know and understand and get the feel of a draft that really gives them an edge on draft day. You've got to have a feel for where the draft's going, when players are falling to you. Is a certain position going off the board? Do you go there? So I'm on board with you. I don't really have a set in stone philosophy. I think that is the wrong way to go. And I do think it is more of an art. You've got to let it come to you. And just like with our rankings sometimes it comes down to really a gut feeling, right? I mean, sometimes you really just kind of have to read the tea leaves a little bit. And sometimes that's all you really need. But I'm with you, Mike. I really don't have a set stone strategy. I advise everyone, you and I both advise everyone not to really have one. You got to kind of think on your toes a little bit. It is an art. And so I think that kind of takes care of that and probably answers a lot of questions that we're going to get. And that's a little proactive right there.
Yeah, one thing I would add, my definite strategy coming towards the end of drafts, I'll tend to stray away from my rankings towards the end of the draft. Why? Because I definitely want to choose players with high upside, right? They play in systems that typically produce huge fantasy points. Maybe those guys aren't necessarily starters at the moment, so they're not as high in our rankings, but say an injury happens or just this just talking about Oklahoma, maybe, for example, if Spencer Rattler is who we think he is, maybe there's somebody down there in my rankings that at wide receiver, that if Spencer Rattler becomes a Baker Mayfield, if we believe that, then that guy now becomes a higher value wide receiver. So towards the end, I will definitely take some chances. That's probably the biggest advice that I would give. But again, it depends on how the draft is going, and I'll evolve my strategy from there.
And I'll give away one of my strategies that I like to do at the end of drafts as well, particularly in the leagues that require kickers, defense, special teams, tight ends. If you really feel that you're light at those positions, I'll tell you what I do. I have a habit in leagues that require to start a kicker and defense, special teams. If I don't get a good one early, I tend to draft players instead of kickers or defensive special teams, because a lot of these drafts that happen from the 4th of July on, we're getting news throughout preseason camp. And I think you're better off grabbing, if your draft format allows it, grabbing extra position players. And then a week before the season starts, figure out, okay, who didn't really stick? Where am I not feeling this? And then just go ahead and get your kicker. So if you do not require a kicker on draft day, or if you're big on streaming defenses, pass on them, load up with position players, and it's a really good way to kind of get ahead of the waiver wire before the season starts. That's one strategy that I like to throw out there to a lot of my followers, if there isn't that rule in place that they must draft a kicker on draft.
In our recent draft, mock draft hosted by John Lobb, we got to the 15th, 16th round, the last round, and I'm like, oh, I don't have a kicker yet. But I subscribe to that same notion. If your league doesn't require you to draft a kicker, no, I'm drafting a high upside running back, wide receiver, and see if that guy hits, right? So I clicked on Taj Harris, I think, from Syracuse. It allowed me to draft him, and I am perfectly content not having a kicker for right now.
No arguments for me, my man. So look, we have done a lot of setting up the table. We've set the table now. So let's start getting into some of our rankings. And let's start at the quarterback, because you mentioned his name before. I think a good starting point for us. Well, let's just start here. Are you on board with Fields, Ellinger, 1-2?
That's not changing for me. Fields and Ellinger, 1-2, that's in pen.
Okay, so I feel the same exact way there. So let's start getting into a little bit of what we see. I think when I check the rankings out, Mike, you and I are pretty Locke, we're pretty tight on 1 through 5 at running back and quarterback. The order changes up a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about Spencer Rattler versus Sam Howell. That's something you and I had said, let's get into a little bit here. It seems to be maybe a little bit of some conversation and some stuff that we've seen on some of our threads throughout the spring. Where do you stand? Spencer Rattler, Sam Howell?
That one is also not changing for me. I thought when I was doing my initial research that I would have Spencer Rattler over Sam Howell. Going through my second draft of rankings and my projections, Sam Howell consistently came up on top of Rattler. I just like there's a lot of reasons that I like Sam Howell. For one, the certainty of an extent of he is the more proven player, right? North Carolina and Oklahoma essentially running the same system, right? So I think the volume is there for Sam Howell. He's got his top 4 wide receivers back. He's got 5 starting offensive linemen, I believe, back. I just like that he is a more proven player right now over Spencer Rattler. The other thing that people seem to forget, and I think he ran for maybe under 100 yards last year, but he ran for 3,000 yards in high school. He was limited by a hamstring last year, so that I would limited his mobility. Not saying he's going to rush for 1,000 yards, but he has that in his repertoire that he can do that. Now, under Phil Longo, their offensive coordinator, they had guys like Jordan Ta'amu who ran for 300 yards and 5-6 touchdowns. So if Howell gets to, say 200 yards and 4 or 5 touchdowns, I think that locks him in at QB3 for me.
Yeah, and this is something that you and I are going to talk about a number of times before we finish this show. I think whether you're going Rattler or Howell, sometimes we're splitting hairs, right? And so when we're talking about guys that are really close, whether they're close in my rankings or your rankings or anyone out there that formulates their own rankings, the one thing that Mike and I will probably tell you is go with the guy that you like, right? If you're somebody that's a rival of Oklahoma and you don't want to have Spencer Rattler on your team, you're not going to miss anything by grabbing Sam Howell. Now, for the sake of this conversation, I'd say that I prefer Rattler. And here are the reasons why I prefer Spencer Rattler. One thing that we talk about a lot of time in college fantasy football are system guys. And it's really hard to doubt right now Lincoln Riley's system. I remember 2 years ago, I did a couple of preseason shows and, people were like wide-eyed because I had Kyler Murray ranked 1 and I had Jalen Hurts, I believe, as the top 2 quarterback, number 2 quarterback last year. And I just, it's hard for me to, and even though Rattler isn't going to give the rushing yards that Hurts or Murray did, I believe if you go back and historically with Lincoln Riley's offenses, I believe his quarterback, the fewest rushing touchdowns they've ever scored in a season is 6 or 7. And if you go back and look at Lincoln Riley's experience as an OC, go all the way back to East Carolina, he was putting these numbers up with Shane Carden and Dominique Davis at quarterback at East Carolina. And so I believe sometimes I trust that Lincoln Riley knows, look, if he went out and recruited Jalen Hurts, he saw with Jalen Hurts what a lot of us didn't, because Jalen Hurts was just a monster last year. If Rattler's the guy, I have to think that based on the historical data, that he's probably going to score 6 or 7 rushing touchdowns minimum. He's probably going to throw for close to 40 touchdowns. And all of a sudden you're looking at somebody that could close to 50. Now, I agree with you with Sam Howell, so I do think we're splitting hairs. I think Sam Howell could give us more in the running game this year. I love Howell's receivers. I mean, Brown and Newsome. It's hard to argue against that. The thing that I like about Rattler, and this is where I think is the separator for me, is the upside in Rattler versus Howell. Because if we think back last year, North Carolina was a 6-6 team that made a bowl game. I actually think North Carolina is going to be pretty darn good this year. I think they're going to be better. How does that affect, let's see what happens to them. Will they be playing from behind? Will they be playing from ahead? Will that affect Howell's passing numbers? I don't think it really will affect them much, but it could a little bit. And Mike, really, that's the only thing that I'm looking at as far as splitting hairs. You've got the unproven upside of Rattler versus the proven commodity with everything proven around him. North Carolina does return, I believe, 4 offensive linemen. Oklahoma, I believe, returns every offensive lineman. So you've got 2 teams that are really rock solid, lines rock solid in front of them. And maybe at the end of the year, when we look back on this conversation, what may be the separator between the two will be their ability to run the ball. Sam Howell versus Spencer Rattler. And for us right now going into 2020, that's probably the biggest question mark because we know what they're going to do through the air.
100% agree with you there. I think the rushing stats is going to determine where they finish at the end of the season in the quarterback rankings. Good news for both of us in our argument is that it's not as though they're going to face a gauntlet in the Big 12 or the ACC in terms of strength of schedule with the defenses. So, they'll face plenty of cupcake defenses throughout the year, I'm sure. We're good there. Again, it's splitting hairs, 3 and 4. I think we would both agree that they are first-round draft picks. In depending on or not,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter regardless of the situation in terms of scoring settings. I think they're both personally first-round draft picks. Some may disagree on that, which I've seen on Twitter, but I will always favor a quarterback in college fantasy regardless.
Yeah, I'm with you. When we talk about 2 quarterback leagues as well, I know in one of the drafts that you and I just did, you took Fields number 1. You've got no argument from me right there. And I took Ellinger, I believe, my first quarterback at maybe the 4th or 5th pick. In 2 quarterback leagues, I do think getting that stud, if you and I have Ellinger and Fields in pen at the top 2 spots, I thought it would be silly to pass on either of those guys if they were available where we drafted. And so you and I pretty much locked up a quarterback with our first pick. And then from there, you can play the waiting game because the quarterbacks, as we're going to get into, it is fairly deep, right? But to get that lock stud that maybe can give you 30-plus points every week is ever so important at the quarterback spot. So when we look at our top 5, you and I have Fields, Ellinger, Rattler, Lawrence, Howell. I believe that's our top 5. If we had to just pick one of those guys that you're least confident in being a top 5 guy, do you have one?
It's Lawrence. Obviously, he's not helped by the injury to Justin Ross. It's the debate as to whether he's going to run it as often, less, more in 2020. I mean, that's hypothetical at this point, in my opinion. People could say, oh, Trevor Lawrence isn't going to run as much this season like he did towards the end of last year because he wants to save himself and his coaching staff may be looking out for him as he has his sights set on the NFL draft after this year.
Yeah.
I think, again, similar to the argument with Spencer Rattler and Sam Howell, is that those rushing stats will determine whether or not Trevor Lawrence finishes as a top five quarterback this year. I mean, just looking back to last year, I see that, he finished with 30 or more fantasy points in the final 5 games, but he, failed to reach, he failed to reach even 20 points in those early season struggles that he had, which clearly he fixed them. But I think he's the one that I'm most nervous about if we're talking about the top 5, just simply because of the injury to Justin Ross and, whether or not he runs the ball as much as he did.
I'm with you. I'm with you as well, even though I have Lawrence over Howell. I think there's 2 things that are going to play into this. I think one, like you said, will Lawrence put his body on the line running the ball? We know what Clemson has. So for me, Clemson, they don't care about weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4. They need to they're worried about winning a national championship. So they need Lawrence healthy at the end of the year. Maybe that played into a little bit why, he got off to such a slow start last year. But what could factor into this equation is maybe Heisman talk too. So, we can't foresee that right now, Mike, but maybe 6, 7 weeks into the season, maybe depending on where the Heisman talk is centered around or who the Heisman talk is centered around, we could see something similar with Lawrence as we did last year where maybe he blossoms in the second half of the season. We'll see. But for me, I'm kind of with you. I don't see North Carolina as even though I think they will be improved, I do think that they're going to be, I think all the pieces are in place. We're going to see pretty close to a mirror image of what we saw of them last year. I think Rattler, that Oklahoma offense, we talked about it, Ellinger over at Texas Fields. And for me, just because Clemson can be so dominant, I am probably least confident in him as far as my top 5 as well. So let's kind of stray out of the top 5, and feel free to mention any names as we go. I know that you and I had kind of talked about a few of these guys, and so we'll kind of start with one that I think you and I have an interesting take on. I've done some other conversations on this in different shows, but Mac Jones, you and I have done some drafts where Mac Jones has really slipped down. You and I were texting each other behind the scenes. What happened to Mac Jones? That all of a sudden did he disappear off the radar? What's your take on Mac Jones this year? What have you seen going on in mock drafts that we've done, in actual drafts that we've done, and what's your value on Mac Jones right now in mid-June?
Let's see. Let me pull up my rankings real quick to see where I have him. Like you said, it seems like he's disappearing in drafts because of the presence of Bryce Young, I would assume.
Yeah.
For Mac Jones, it's a sense of my strategy of not really how the draft plays out will ultimately decide who I draft in my draft. So if I'm sure when it happened in the last draft, I believe you selected Mac Jones. If he gets to a certain point in that 9th and 10th round, it's hard to ignore him at a certain point. Now, that's the purpose of us doing these early best ball drafts, these early mock drafts, is that we are noticing Mac Jones fall. So, again, while we have him maybe in our top 20 in our rankings, don't go ahead and jump for him in those early rounds, because we are seeing that people are letting him fall, and you can get him at a value later in the draft.
Yeah, I think the obviously the presence of Young is scared people off. If you look back to what Mac Jones did at the tail end of the 2019 season, he played exceptionally well, had some really good numbers. And
yeah, can we not talk about that, because that came against Michigan?
Okay, well said. Yeah, I think, but if this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier in the show too. There's no spring for Bryce Young. And so, now we have to assume that Jones right now has a leg up on Young going into the season. And so we've seen Mac Jones slip in every draft that we've done. So there are a lot of people that are scared away. But the value's there at a certain point. It's hard to pass on. Because if you have potential, and we know Alabama's offense, if you could potentially get a 35-plus touchdown quarterback that late in the draft where we've seen Mac Jones slip, that right there is value, right? So you and I are seeing Mac Jones slip, and we wouldn't reach for him early, but at some point, and this is where the draft really comes to you. In the last draft that I did, the reason I went for Mac Jones is I had Sam Ellinger as my first quarterback. I slept on quarterbacks. All of a sudden, after the top guys and maybe, the second tier guys went, next thing you know, I'm sitting there with a chance to scoop up Mac Jones, 35-plus touchdown potential as my quarterback too. And the upside, like you and I talk about, was just too great to pass up. And so that was one of the instances where I went for Mac Jones, because I kind of let the draft fall to me and I felt the value was too hard to pass up. I'm not going to be a guy that reaches up for Mac Jones in the top 7-8 rounds, but if he falls and the value's there, I do think I agree with you right there. It's hard to pass up Jones given the value that he could produce in that Alabama offense if he sticks as the starter. So,
and this is something that I know you subscribe to, the importance of the early season, right? If we'll always have quarterbacks most likely in the G5 conferences that have that brutal non-conference schedule, right? I'm just looking at Dustin Crum right now, brutal non-conference schedule to start. And then we have them, we'll have subscribers and people who use our rankings, and Dustin Crum gets off to that, not so hot start, and be like, well, what the heck do these guys know? Why am I looking at these rankings? That is not the case with Mac Jones. I'm looking at his schedule, and I think he has one top 25 projected defense in Georgia within the first, 7-8 weeks.
Yeah.
So you are going to get good numbers from Mac Jones while you're making a run for the playoffs. Now, once you get into the playoffs, if you're going to have Mac Jones available for you, if they're looking to get Bryce Young some snaps late, if there's a transition like we saw with Tua back a few years ago, maybe that happens with Bryce Young. But I think I agree with you. They're going to start Mac Jones right away. And I think you're going to get some very good production out of him.
Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up. You and I talk about it all the time. So much of the way we're judged from a lot of our followers is weighted in the first half of the season, because if you're behind the 8 ball early, it's hard to kind of catch up, especially in head-to-head type leagues where there's a playoff format at the end. And so we are, sometimes rank players like Dustin Crum and Isaiah McCoy from Kent State with a little bit of caution, because they do open up with 3 of their first 4 on the road at Penn State, at Kentucky, and at Alabama. For a MAC team, I don't care how good they are, that's still challenging. But the value is in the second half. So you have to draft deep. You have to give yourself some depth, and you have to be willing to know that you're not going to get a lot from those guys early on. But, speaking of scheduling, though, and how that plays into the rankings, I have Adrian Martinez, Mike, ranked pretty high. I really am expecting a bounce back year from Martinez. I have him, I believe he's ranked 11 in my rankings. I'm sorry, I have him 12 behind Derek King down there at Miami. I like Martinez this year for a bounce back year. We know health problems played in. It seems like there was some stuff going on within that Nebraska program. I may be a little bit on an island this year, but I think the way the schedule plays out for Nebraska, the danger for them is really on the back end. And I really think that they have a chance to get things rolling here in the front half, in the first half of the schedule. And Martinez, if he can come out of the gate fast this year, I'm really looking for a bounce back year from him. That's why I have him ranked in my top 12. What's your take on Martinez this year?
I don't have a ton of hard-hitting analysis and statistics for Adrian Martinez. Honestly, for Nebraska, I compare them to Michigan. You see all these prognosticators, right? And they rank Michigan so high in the preseason polls, right? And you got everybody saying, why is Michigan here? Why is Michigan here when they continue to fail and fail repeatedly? Again, you see the same thing with Nebraska. Last year, people are projecting them to win the Big Ten West, and what happened? They fall flat on their face, right? So I like Adrian Martinez. I have him as my 26th ranked quarterback. Like you said, that early season schedule is appealing. They get Purdue, Central Michigan, FCS opponent, whoever that is, with Illinois. That back half, I'm not liking whatsoever with Ohio State, Penn State. I don't, again, I don't look at defenses or the whole roster as an entirety. I don't see Nebraska reaching the heights that some expect this year. Again, just for the simple fact that I compare them to Michigan, and they usually fail to reach the expectations that we see. Again, the Scott Frost offense has produced big-time quarterbacks. I am not concerned with the J.D. Spielman transfer. I think they should be just fine with Wan'Dale Robinson. And I need to do some extra digging on Omar Manning, the JUCO transfer. But he should add some size to that group. But with those two locked in as the wide receiver 1 and 2, I know they added, 4 or 5 freshman receivers to bolster that depth. I think they should be fine. I just don't have them rated as highly for you.
And I'm with you, because you know where I'm going next. Somebody that you do have ranked higher than me, and we'll kind of flip the script a little bit. We'll go to Spencer Sanders, Oklahoma State. I know you'd like to spend a couple of minutes on him. You have him much higher than I do. What do you like about Spencer Sanders this year?
Well, for Spencer, I think the issues with his game that we saw last year, I think the Oklahoma State staff knows exactly what they need to fix with him. My friend Josh sent me a great Twitter thread that had, it was, 12 or 13 tweets deep, that was pinpointing that how Spencer Sanders was consistently looking towards one receiver. And once that receiver wasn't open, that one read that he had, he would go ahead and tuck and run, right? So I think the Oklahoma State staff knows what they have to fix with him. They added Tim Rattay, a former NFL quarterback, now as his quarterback's coach. I think that should help Um, honestly, my main point, like, think of the top 3 fantasy producing schools in college fantasy football, right? Ohio State and Oklahoma are right at the top. Who's the other one? It's Oklahoma State, right? They, Mike Gundy made Taylor Cornelius a top 5 fantasy quarterback. I saw enough out of Spencer Sanders, both with his arm talent and his rushing ability, that I could not. His upside is so high that I felt comfortable slotting him in at 6.
You know, I'm wondering, sometimes I'm a year early. This goes for both of us. Sometimes we're just a year early on the guy, and that's just the way it is. Last year, I was super high on Spencer Sanders. So I think that's what turned me off, or kind of had me rank him with a little bit of caution heading into this season, because I'm with you. It was Tylan Wallace or run last year. There was no wide receiver 2 and wide receiver 3. Seemed like no second and third read at Oklahoma State. And the reason I ranked Spencer Sanders so high last year going into the 2019 season was because of the system. We know what quarterbacks have done in that system, and it was hard not to really fall in love with Spencer Sanders' skill set and his potential. That does concern me a little bit, though, because I didn't really – my concern is that I kind of grade players sometimes with my eyes and go with my gut. And when I watched him enough, I just did not know if I saw the it in him that I really loved. And I think the other thing there's 2 things that make me – now here's one thing. Tylan Wallace, if he bounces back fully healthy, would be that would be great for the Oklahoma State offense. It may actually be better for Spencer Sanders if he's slow to come back, because that may force him to have to look for a few guys instead of leaning on Tylan Wallace. But we also have that guy, Chuba Hubbard, at Oklahoma State, too, who carried the ball, 900 times last year. I know he is not going to get that many carries this year, but it's going to be hard for them not to lean on Chuba Hubbard this year. And so I do worry a little bit about Sanders losing some of that rushing value just because of Hubbard's presence. So I think for me, it's just a little bit of what I actually saw with my eyes. Maybe the fact that I was burned a little bit with Spencer Sanders last year. But I can't argue with anything that you say right there, because that's exactly how I felt about Spencer Sanders, Mike Gundy, and the Oklahoma State system. Matter of fact, last year on some of my shows, I even went on record at the beginning of the year saying that Spencer Sanders, Tylan Wallace, and Chuba Hubbard would be the top fantasy trio, running back, wide receiver, quarterback in the nation. I did predict that at the beginning of the year last year. Maybe I was 1 year too early on that. We'll see. So I do like the fact that I like that you like Spencer Sanders this year. It makes me feel good. I'm just a little cautious with him.
I think some of his passing ability is correctable, and like I said, the addition of the new QB coach. Now they don't have Sean Gleason, their offensive coordinator. He's gone to Rutgers. I personally think that helps them. So maybe that helps Spencer Sanders there, having another voice in the room. I think some of his passing ability is correctable. The Chuba Hubbard factor is what concerns me. So, I mean, his rushing number, Spencer Sanders' rushing numbers were fine last year. He still had 139 carries, which was the most from any Oklahoma State quarterback in the last 6 years. It's the rushing stat. So I'm looking at Mason Rudolph and Taylor Cornelius. Both of them had 10 rushing touchdowns with less carries, where Spencer Sanders had 2. So I think the Chuba Hubbard factor, which you mentioned, is going to be a main factor in determining how high Spencer Sanders finishes this year. But I think you mentioned it too. You can't deny the upside with the Oklahoma State offense. If he hits Spencer Sanders, he's going to hit big.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about a couple of guys that we, or a couple of guys we have differences on. We could sit here. Let's be honest, Mike, you and I could probably go into tomorrow and talk about all these players. I mean, that's just kind of what we love to do. Let's kind of go off a little bit into a different area. Maybe let's highlight maybe 2 or 3 guys for each of us that maybe we like, or let's start with the guys that maybe we're staying away from right now. Maybe 2 or 3 guys that we'll stay away from. While you're thinking about it, I'll kind of set the table with throwing out my first name. And for me, I think it's Charlie Brewer over at Baylor. And it has nothing to do with his fantasy ability. I think it has to do 100% on his health for me. I think, obviously anybody playing in the Big 12, for fantasy wise, that's gold. What I worry about is that I'd reach for Charlie Brewer. I've stayed away from Charlie Brewer in every draft so far, and I think we have to rank him based on his fantasy talent. But I'm also worried that one more concussion would not only end him for a game and not only end him for a season, but end him for his career. He had 4 concussions last year, so it's hard for me to really take Charlie Brewer right now and have a lot of confidence to feel that I'm going to get out of the season with a healthy quarterback. Now, I say that, and if you remember, our boy over Eric Dungy at Syracuse battled the same issue for the first 3 years he was in that orange uniform, and then had a really good senior year. But for me, and I'll kind of throw the name out there, the first one, for me, one of the names that I'm a little scared of right now and staying away from is Charlie Brewer, just because of the history of concussions.
For me, Charlie Brewer that's the only concern with him. I really like Charlie Brewer as a quarterback. I think he gives you some dual threat ability, but because he can run it so well, that has led to the injuries, right? And so for me, Charlie Brewer injuries, that is my only concern with him. I think he's going to be boosted with Larry Fedora now as his offensive coordinator. Now, self-admittedly, I haven't been able to dig into Baylor as much this year to this point because of those team previews that we've been doing. So I had to focus on other teams. They have 4 returning starters back in the offensive line. Larry Fedora now in coordinating the offense. I think based on memory right now, they're losing quite a bit on the defensive side of the ball. So you're going to be in that with that Big 12 schedule, might be in some shootouts. I think that is a plus sign for Charlie Brewer. But again, injuries, not sure you can trust him, whether the staff cuts back on his carries. That, again, hurts his value in CFF. So I like him. I have him as QB 43, I believe. But he would be just a late round pick for me.
Yeah, I got him up all the way at 23. I'm with you. I mean, it's the fantasy talent's undeniable. That's not the concern for me. I just look at some other players around where I have him ranked, and if they're available, I'm probably just shying away from Brewer right there, just from injury alone. That would be the factor for me in a tiebreaker if I'm comparing him to a player I've got really close. How about for yourself? 1 or 2 names out there that you kind of hit the pause button, kind of have a yield sign up before you drafting them based on what you see going on in some of the industry drafts that we're doing?
Starting to be more concerned with KJ Costello. That's, again, it's a Mike Leach offense. So they produce big-time fantasy numbers through the passing game, even in that first year. I think there may be some – if you look back, I think they've struggled a little bit in their first year, but it's still – you're putting up 3,000-plus passing yards. Now, Mike Leach offense, you're expecting 4,000 and 5,000 passing yards. But that schedule is just brutal. I think it's pretty manageable to start, but then you get Texas A&M, a bye week, Alabama, LSU, Auburn, Missouri, Kentucky, right in a row. All projected top 25 defenses mixed in with a bye week. Yeah. He's going high in drafts, and I'm just not that I'm not sold on him. If he falls to me at a certain point, I'm all for taking a Mike Leach quarterback, and this might be one of his best ever in KJ Costello. But as far as highly as he's going in our drafts, I'm perfectly content.
Where do you have him ranked right now?
I have him 13th right now.
Okay, so I'm 10. We're not far off right there. I'll tell you, this is a point I made about KJ, made about just this. I'll say this in general. The last 5 or 6 years, we have seen an evolution in the SEC, particularly the SEC West. It's no longer – so I'm with you. Yeah, there are some tough defenses in there. But we're also looking at what has historically been probably the best defensive division in any conference in college football all of a sudden become offensive-minded. It started with Alabama a few years ago. We know what LSU did last year with that historical offense. You've got Kendall Briles now at Arkansas. You've got Mike Leach now at Mississippi State. You've got Kiffin and Levy down at Ole Miss now. this is not the SEC West from 5 or 6 years ago. And you've got Chad Morris who's gone on, and he's now at Auburn. So this, to me, is as wide open as offense we've seen the SEC West ever in college fantasy football in the history that we've been doing it. So, yes, I'm with you. Tough defenses, but will that just mean more garbage time for Mike Leach and his air raid offense as we go? I don't know. I think that is the biggest unknown. But for me, I'm not subscribing into the tougher defenses in the SEC anymore, because all of those offenses now are completely wide open. And I think we're going to see now. So, yeah, I mean, look at the LSU-Alabama game last year. What a turn that was from 9-6 just, several years before that. I think that could be more of the norm in the SEC West now. So I'm a little bit on the side of KJ Costello. What I'm a little worried about, Mike, is just the system wasn't in place before. And what receivers do we have there? We saw Shavers, the Alabama transfer, now go there. That's going to help some things out. But for me, whether or not Washington State, how they adapt in this first year in transition, I'm completely with you on that. That's the one thing that makes me a little concerned heading into the 2020 season, is that this is a transition year for Leach, right? So
I think that's one of the biggest storylines just in college football in general, is the transition of these SEC teams transitioning to offense. They saw what LSU did last year with Joe Burrow and Joe Brady, and they want to emulate that. You see the change in offensive coordinator at Georgia. You see Mike Leach now on board. You see Ole Miss going. They were still an offensive-minded team, but they made the coaching change to the UCF coordinator that I can't name offhand. But you see these teams wanting to emulate LSU from last year because they saw that success. Whether they have it or not remains to be seen.
Yeah. Well, look, here's the thing. Forget about the guys that we don't love, right? Let's start to kind of go into the guys that we do like. Let's throw out 2 or 3 guys on there that we have ranked that maybe we feel personally maybe we have them underranked, undervalued. Who are some guys maybe in your rankings, or maybe just guys in general in these drafts, guys that you really like that you're going for at the quarterback position, or when you're drafting them, you feel like you're not overreaching, and if anything, maybe you see yourself grabbing them a little earlier than where you actually have them ranked because you like them?
Well, Spencer Sanders, one, for obvious reasons. I do like Sam Hartman from Wake Forest. I mean, we've seen that offense produce big-time numbers. I think you would agree we love that wide receiver corps for Wake Forest with Donovan Green and Sage Surratt. I don't see any way in which, I don't want to put that out there, but it's hard to envision a scenario where Sam Hartman fails. I think he's a better passer personally than Jamie Newman. I think he can run. He's not as thickly built as Newman, but he will still get 100+ carries in that offense. So I really like Sam Hartman. The one guy that I'm sure you've noticed that I've been going out on a limb on, and he's my QB 25, just ahead of Adrian Martinez, is Clayton Tune from Houston. I saw this in an article within The Athletic. The year 2 trend of Dana Holgorsen quarterbacks. If you take the 6 years for year 2 of Dana Holgorsen quarterbacks, that averages out to 4,000+ yards and 38 total touchdowns. So I like what I've seen from Tune. He's got the wide receiver corps to succeed, I think, with Marquez Stevenson and company. He can run a little bit. He's not Derek King on the ground, but I think he ran a 4.58 in high school. That was coming off of a torn ACL. So the guy can move a bit. If he can continue that trend of Dana Holgorsen quarterbacks in year 2, I think you're going to hit big on Clayton Tune. And if I wasn't in the draft, he's probably going undrafted at this point.
I actually have Tune ranked around the 40 mark for me, but I think you and I are pretty much lockstep on Marquez Stevenson, and we'll get there at the wide receivers in a bit. And I do think I like, what happened at Houston last year was a dumpster fire, right? So I think hopefully they've gotten that ironed out. And so that will allow for a smoother year two. So I'm with you on that. We'll see. I'm not particularly sure if I have Tune for me in the top 30, but I have him there at 40, but we'll see where things look in the preseason. You're right. The pieces are in place.
That's one of those picks that we discussed earlier in the podcast that, like, you can take him late, and if he hits, you're going to hit big. That's a huge difference maker. If he can reach those yardage and touchdown totals, that's a league winner potentially for you if he succeeds.
Yeah, one guy for me that I'll mention, the one guy that I really like this year, and I took him in the first best ball draft we did, and I know sometimes you have a tendency to do this as well. Sometimes I'll stay away from a guy just to see what some of my contemporaries feel, just to see how far a player will fall. I drafted Mikael Cunningham in the first best ball draft we did, and I stayed away in the second draft. But he's somebody that I really like this year. I like what Satterfield's done over there at Louisville. I mean, when you look back last year, it took them a while to figure out who his quarterback was. Hawkins emerged there. We've got Atwell at receiver. I just feel like most of the pieces are coming back at Louisville now. And I really like the progress that I saw at the end of the year last year. There were two teams that I saw at the end of 2019 that I was really impressed with, that I said, man, when it comes to betting, I'd love to get some season totals on these two teams going into, well, there were three going into 2020. Tennessee was one, North Carolina was one, and Louisville was the other. I really like what Cunningham did, the way he grasped the offense in the second half of the season, and some of the numbers that he put up were just absolutely sick. If he can start off fast the way that he finished over the second half of last season, I think you could have a nice fantasy steal right there. I think I might be a little bit on an island with Cunningham, but I really love the fantasy potential in that offense and everything that Cunningham has around him over there at Louisville.
Where do you have him at ranked?
I've got Cunningham at 15 right now.
Okay.
And I'd imagine I have him higher than you.
Yep. You have him higher. Let's see. I can pull it up. He's somewhere in the 20s for me, I believe. I like Cunningham as well. I think knowing that he is the full-time starter going into year two of that system, I think obviously helps him out. My concern with him is the system. Under Satterfield, I don't think that quarterbacks necessarily have an upside. I'm just looking at it now. I don't see a season, I don't believe, in which they've had a quarterback. Now, it could change because he's quite an athlete. Okay, well, Zach Thomas had 10 touchdowns in 20.
And didn't we think that about Taylor Lamb at Appalachians? Wasn't he there when was Lamb there? Was he there with Lamb?
Yep. From 2014 to 17. Yep.
Who had some really sneaky fantasy seasons in the Sun Belt down there. Yep. So I just look historically at the running back one and the quarterback one in that offense. And for me, that's, if I'm going to target something on a Satterfield team, that would be it. That's the reason why I like Cunningham. Like I said, I was, last year, Mike, I was high on Pass. I thought Pass would go into the season. I thought he was going to be the starter. I was higher on Pass last year, I think maybe rankings, than I was on Cunningham this year. I think that scared me from ranking Cunningham even a little higher than I really wanted to. But I think we mentioned before, a lot of it goes into the schedule. I mean, what defenses are there to be scared of in the ACC, other than Clemson right now? So
they get Clemson in week 2. So you knock that out right away. They face Western Kentucky in week 4, which, I think they bring most of their starters back, so that might be tough. But again, it's a G5 opponent, so Louisville should be able to handle them, and Mikael Cunningham can put up.
So I do think Cunningham for me is one of the players that's going a little bit lower than where I have him ranked. And I can't move on, and we can go into some more names. If you have one, there's one guy that I really want to mention because I did a podcast, with Bogman and Lob last year. And the one name that I threw out was Joe Burrow. I said, don't sleep on Joe Burrow and that LSU offense. But the one thing that I didn't do last year, because I said that, is I really didn't kind of back it up in my rankings. I still had Burrow around the 50 mark, 45 mark. So even though I had him as a sleeper, I didn't rank him where I probably should have. And so one guy that I'm starting to have a sneaky suspicion on this year. So I ranked him a little higher this year where than I normally would, because if I missed the boat on Burrow, I didn't want to miss it this year. I'm starting to feel good about if Chad Morris takes over that offense at Auburn and Malzahn really does hand over the reins. I'm feeling good about Bo Nix year 2. Seth Williams there. He's got a few receivers there. We don't have the necessarily proven workhorse back like we have in years past. I think you're going to see the Auburn offense open up a little bit. One guy that I'm targeting as a really late sleeper in a lot of leagues is Bo Nix at Auburn. And I do think the key to him having a big year is for Morris to actually get the keys to the offense, which, from what I've read, seems to be happening this year at Auburn.
And we spoke about that previously with the kind of the turnover of coaches trying to emulate LSU. I think Auburn is another one of those teams that I failed to mention that wants to go in that direction of offense and what we saw with LSU the previous year. I don't think I'm as high on Bo. You know what? He's in my top 30, so I like Bo Nix.
I don't expect anybody to be as high as me. I'm going on the island on this one, Mike.
Well, you know what? That's what you have to do with rankings. You saw me with Spencer Sanders, so we're not going to follow the conventional wisdom every time.
But with coaching changes, this is a good segue with coaching changes, because I know you have some thoughts. And look, one thing that we did in sort of prepping for the show is we did not want to dive too much into quarterback battles, right? Because there's just so much that can change. We really wanted this show to be, to kind of stand the test of summer and our opinions stick all the way to preseason camp. And then things can start to change a little bit with some schools with these quarterback battles. But with Nick Rolovich going over to Washington State, we mentioned Mike Leach going over to Mississippi State. I know you've got some thoughts on on the freshman coming in, right? At Washington State. What's your thoughts at quarterback at Washington State? I know that was one spot that you really wanted to kind of spend a couple of minutes on.
Yeah, we talked about it at the start of the show, how the lack of spring practices is probably going to hurt a lot of the incoming freshmen. I don't see that being the case for Jayden de Laura at Washington State. In high school, he ran the run and shoot offense. So while, it's an advantage for Cameron Cooper and Gunnar Cruz to be on campus learning Nick Rolovich's system right now, well, Jayden de Laura has ran it. So I think he actually has an experience edge running that system over the likes of Cameron Cooper. Now, Cameron Cooper, more experienced player, even though he hasn't gotten that much time. He's very easily, Cameron Cooper could win that job. And I'm pretty sure you have him as your QB1 for Washington State. I like the fact that he's played in this system before. The fact that there is no spring practices might actually end up helping him. And I watched a little bit of him on tape, and I liked what I saw. I think he's got the skill set to fit in that system. I think his running ability is probably better than Cooper at this point. He reminded me of Cole McDonald personally. I'm not a football savant, so I'm not judging talent on tape like some of these NFL draft guys or guys.
You and I both.
I liked what I saw from de Laura on tape, and I think the fact that I think that's a special case with these freshmen this year is that he's played in that system, and I think that gives
everybody in that system, because of the cancellation of spring, is starting off at the same point. So whether you're true freshman or you're Cameron Cooper with some experience, right, you're at the same starting point. So I do that's a really good point for this conversation. The reason why I'm just a little hesitant on it is because sometimes I fall back on coaching tendencies. And when we watched last year, if you look back at McDonald's numbers, they were really good. But if you followed him, or if you were an owner of Cole McDonald, there was a lot of headache and a lot of frustration. One early pick, and next thing you know, Chevin Cordero was coming on the field, and there were a lot of guys that had, stayed up till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and they got burned by Cole McDonald. That's my fear with Rolovich coming in, is that he hasn't had the time with these guys. And will we see a lot of rotation through the first few weeks of the season? The one thing with Rolovich coming in there is he's going to have a long leash. The pressure is not going to be for him to win in year one, even though there seems to be a lot of coaches think that they do have the pressure to win in year one. My thing is, I think we are going to see some quarterback rotation over at Washington State this year early. And I think you just maybe need to hit on the right guy, Mike. And if we mentioned earlier, Mikhail Cunningham over at Louisville. Last year we had Pass, we had Evan Conley, and then finally it was Cunningham who emerged. Maybe we see something like that at Washington State this year. I don't know. Your point's well taken. So if you like DeLora, I think you jump on him. But for me, I think that's the reason why I'm sort of shying away from the Washington State quarterback.
Yep, you made a great point there. And Rolovich has been, I mean, we've seen it. Didn't he dress up somebody as a Cole McDonald decoy on the sidelines just to hide who his starter would be? So he is kind of a wild card. He did seem to have a quick leash last year with his quarterbacks, or the last 2 years. So I definitely agree that he could rotate his quarterbacks, especially early on. This would be a longer conversation for a different time, and I know that me and you have had this conversation previously. Rankings are very different from projections, right? And so I have DeLora, I think, in my, between 35 and 40, or maybe in high 30s in my rankings. When I projected out his full season, that was closer to the top 10. I think it was 11 or 12. So if some guy wins the job and hold on to it full time, he's going to be a difference maker at the quarterback position. But we can't rank whoever it is, Cooper or DeLora, that high, because we have no idea what the staff is going to choose.
Yeah, I think we would be doing a lot of our followers a disservice if we just played if we gave all three quarterbacks a third of the projections that we do. We have to project someone, and we have to go with who we feel, based on the research that we've done, who we think are likely to win the job, or who is likely to win the job. And then I do scale back, given the fact that I think we will see rotation. But you and I don't do that. We don't say, okay, they could possibly have three guys. Let's just take the total projections, divide them by 3, and we'll just live in the safe zone. It's no fun doing that. We can't do that. It wouldn't be fair to all of our followers. And so I think all of the points that we just made are right on. And we talk about it all the time. Projections are different than rankings. Projections are a little bit more just, they're objective, where we're just can be a little bit more subjective and kind of give somebody an upgrade or downgrade based on the gut feeling, based on the eye test, and based on some of the tendencies that we've seen over time. So that's a great point. That's a great point. So let's have a little fun before we move on from quarterbacks. Couple of guys, maybe some late sleepers that we haven't mentioned that you have really far down on your list. That could be, and I'm not going to say the Joe Burrow, but not from a number standpoint, but maybe the surprise, like some guys that maybe you have 40 plus, 50 plus, that maybe we're talking about 1 or 2 weeks into the season that maybe some of us whiffed on draft day. You have 1 or 2 names for me, some deep sleepers?
Yeah, he's not really a deep sleeper, but Michael Penix Jr. at Indiana, we haven't seen him drafted much at all in some of our early drafts. I think there was a conversation on Twitter recently that if you look at the numbers, his passing volume in that offense was higher last year than Sam Howell. So he's going to be throwing it. He's a very good athlete, so he can give you some of that dual threat rushing numbers. You can probably agree that we haven't seen him drafted much at all. He's got his top wide receivers back in Whop Philyor, Ty Freifogel. We'll see the tight end situation with Hendershot, but volume is going to be there for him to succeed.
Yeah, I think for me, I think 2 names for me that I'll throw out. One we have seen drafted at a reasonable time, because I've tried to get him a couple of times. So there seems to be a couple of guys that kind of snipe me on him. I'm interested to see Malik Willis over at Liberty. I think that could be an interesting pairing now with Hugh Freeze. Obviously, he inherited Calvert, but Malik Willis is probably a little bit more of his ideal quarterback. We've seen Willis get drafted, but for me, one of the sneaky late names that I'm going to throw out there, for me, could be Chase Bryce at Duke, the former Clemson player. Knowing what will Bryce emerge as some sort of Daniel Jones? Remember a couple of years ago where Daniel Jones, I think, all of a sudden ran for 4 or 5 touchdowns, had a good game throwing the ball, and all of a sudden he was on the fantasy radar. I think last year was a little bit of the slip from the norm for quarterbacks under Cutcliffe over there at Duke, and I'd be interested. I think Chase Bryce is a really good deep sleeper that I don't think I in the drafts that we've done, I don't remember Bryce getting drafted. Do you?
No, he was not. And I agree. I don't think he's going to have the upside at Duke, but I agree that he is going to be a consistent backup on your fantasy squad. I think Daniel Jones averaged, at least 6 rushing touchdowns every year that he was the starter. Probably going to get that same production from Bryce. I agree with that one. One name that I wanted to throw out too was Curtis Rourke at Ohio. Always going to subscribe to drafting a Rourke at quarterback. We saw what with Nathan Rourke. I mean, top 15 option every single year that he was the starter. His younger brother is bigger, I believe, just as good a runner. He might even have a better arm. Ohio brings back a lot on offense, so I will always subscribe to the notion of drafting a Rourke.
I'm with you on that one, Mike. I haven't had to draft Rourke in any of our drafts just based on where we're at, but I'm with you. I mean, given the history of that offense, if Rourke sticks as the quarterback one there, you're looking at probably someone that he's probably a top 15 fantasy quarterback. If he's the quarterback one all year long in that Ohio offense, he's going to be a top 15 fantasy quarterback by the end of the year. And he is down in my rankings too, just for the unknown, but that's a great one. Really like that.
Can I throw out a super deep sleeper?
Man, you could throw out as many super sleepers as you want. Nobody's going to tell us no.
No? Okay, so I mean, this one is just shot in the dark. But,
go ahead.
There is a JUCO transfer at New Mexico State. Now, I'm sure you agree. We don't subscribe to drafting very many New Mexico State players. I mean, that's a FCS type school down there that they got, right? And the coaching staff's probably going to get let go at the end of the season. I like Jonah Johnson from what I saw on film. He is a big boy, probably 230 pounds. They will run their quarterbacks if needed. Tyler Rogers, I think way back when, he was giving you close to 100 carries, maybe 5 or 6 touchdowns. And if you remember, too, under the staff, they finished in the top 10 in the country in passing volume, however many times in the last 4 or 5 years. So if you have deep rosters, I would give Jonah Johnson a look.
And Mike, guess what? We're just going to tease that out there. It's not the last time we're going to mention New Mexico State in this on this show.
Well, yeah, I know who you're referencing.
I'm sure you know what's coming. So let's transition to running backs now, right? I think I mentioned this earlier. You and I are pretty much in agreement with the top 5. I don't necessarily know if it's the same order. I have Hubbard, Etienne, Gainwell, Patterson. I can make an argument for any of those 4 guys being in any particular order. I even think, do you have Kobe Lewis at 5?
Or I have Kobe Lewis at 5, yeah.
Okay, so we are in the same boat for the top 5. So we're going to kind of start off here where we started with the quarterbacks. Maybe not take so much time here. Just kind of give me a brief overview of your top 5, what your thoughts on each guy, and maybe of the 5, who would you be least confident in? And we'll kind of end it there with the top 5 like we did with the quarterbacks.
So Chuba Hubbard is one. I think that's stating the obvious. I have analysis for 2 through 4 for Gainwell, Etienne, and Jared Patterson, right? I personally think we're splitting hairs. You mentioned this at the start of the podcast. You take which guy that you want to root for. You take which guy you feel should or could have the best season of those 3. I honestly don't care who you favor between 2 through 4. Patterson, Etienne, or Gainwell. You could nitpick either one. I think regardless, they're all 3 solidly within the top 4. Kobe Lewis, I actually, when the season ended last year, you threw him out as a potential top 2, first 2-round draft pick. And I was like, man, looking at the numbers, Joe was spot on there, taking over as the full-time starter. I do have some concerns now because they only return 1 or 2 offensive linemen, I believe, something like that.
2 linemen. Yeah.
Yep. Can you name the starting quarterback next year for Central Michigan? Daniel Richardson, maybe. I have no idea who it's going to be. I think David Moore might come back at some point.
David Moore is actually going to be suspended. I almost
He's going to come back later in the season, I believe.
Daniel Richardson I think, is going to open up as the starter.
Yeah. But so, like, we have no idea what to expect. He was probably third or fourth on the depth chart last year. We don't know what to expect out of him. So the defenses are really going to be locking in, I feel like, on Kobe Lewis. Again, with the turnover on the offensive line, we'll see what happens. I think there's so much vacated production at Central Michigan that he should I have him fifth, so I'm high on him. But if I have to list a concern for somebody in that top five, that would be where I would be concerned with Kobe Lewis.
Yeah, what's interesting, Mike, with the return of Lyman, and this is something I'll have to save for another show because I don't have it in here in front of me, but there was some research that I did based on return in Lyman. And in some cases, it did not apply last year. I think going into the 2019 season, Oklahoma and Wisconsin were two teams that returned one or fewer starters going into 2019. And we didn't shy away from Oklahoma players or Wisconsin players. So obviously we do know the system. And so let's hopeful, I think you and I are both hopeful that a lot plays out for much the same over at Central Michigan this year. So like you said, there's really not much. We are splitting hairs. I'll throw out a couple of interesting thoughts and maybe throw out a point that I haven't mentioned on any other show until this one right here. I'm agreeing with Hubbard on one. I think the volume that he gets, knowing that right now that the Oklahoma State offense, until we know for sure what we're going to get from Spencer Sanders, that offense is going to go through Chuba Hubbard. ATN, we already know what he can do. He doesn't need a lot of touches to give it to you. The reason why I have ATN too is just because ATN has been so incredibly consistent, not only just last year, but through his career at Clemson. He doesn't need a lot of touches. He's probably gold for at least a touchdown every week. He may only need 12 touches. He's not going to give you the 300 yards or 250 yards and 5 touchdowns that maybe somebody out of the MAC can give you, like a Kobe Lewis. But he's going to pretty much be solid for 100 total yards of offense and at least 1 to 2 touchdowns every week. And so for me, the reason why I have him at 2 is just from the consistency standpoint. Kenneth Gainwell, I have at 3 if he's used the way that he's used last year. Let's be honest, the only thing that kept Gainwell from probably being the top back last year was Patrick Taylor's return at the end of the year. So we've seen Norville move on to Florida State, but the offensive coordinator was promoted from within. So I think that will pretty much ensure continuity within the offense. And so I do see a lot of utilization, very similar in 2020 as we saw in 2019 for Gainwell. I do have Kobe Lewis at 5. You and I can go into detail about the volume that running back 1 has potential to get without a proven running back 2. We also had a Wildcat quarterback last year who was the tight end at Central Michigan that even vultured some touchdowns last year. He's even gone. Was it Lazaro?
Tony Polzan, or that's the tight end. That was the tight end
last year. I think it was Lazaro
quarterback.
Quarterback, yeah.
Yeah.
He came in and vultured some touchdowns. He's gone. Jonathan Ward's gone. And so really Kobe, and with David Moore not being there, we don't know what Richardson's going to give him. That's why I really like Lewis just from a volume of touches standpoint. But here's a point I'll make about Jarrett Patterson, and this will really play into the pros if you like Patterson. I'll make a case for Patterson maybe even finishing as the top fantasy running back this year, and that's a lot because the one thing that we've noticed in a lot of our best ball drafts, and the case can be made for Kevin Marks possibly being the best handcuff out there in college fantasy football for 2020, particularly in best ball leagues, because if a guy like Patterson goes down, Marks moves into that running back 1 spot, and he's going to have all the carries by himself. But the case that I'll make for Patterson, and this is kind of, I'm playing in the conspiracy theory guy, but I think in my position, I like to have some of these theories because I think they've worked for me well in the past. Patterson and Marks are both, I believe, juniors. And so, no, they're juniors, right? So they both can be eligible to leave at the end of this year. Sometimes we look at a roster like this and we say, 2 proven running backs like this. If you remember and look back at the end of last year, you take the last 4 games, Patterson was pretty much, he was used almost exclusively. Marks was a true running back too. At the end of last year, Patterson was used as more of a true running back 1. For most of the year, they were sort of 1A and 1B. But those last 4 or 5 games, Patterson was getting 25 plus carries, and he was almost used exclusively as the starter. I see that happening throughout the entire season this year. And here's where my conspiracy theory comes in. If all of a sudden now Leopold has two 1,100-yard backs, they're both going to look at each other and say, man, we've done some serious things here. We're both going pro. He loses one of those two guys. If he uses Patterson exclusively, gives him 250, 275, maybe even 300 carries this year, and all of a sudden he breaks out for 1,700, 1,800 yards, 17, 18 touchdowns, and Marks is there with a 600-yard season, I don't think we're going to see Marks leave, whereas Marks can say, man, next year that could be me. I can run for 15, 16, 1,700, and I can be elevated in my status. I know that's really like, man, I'm throwing conspiracy out there, but man, these are some of the things that I think about going into whether or not they're going to timeshare at this particular point in their career. So look, I know it's conspiracy theory, but that's why I do like Patterson. I think he's going to be used a lot this year.
Okay, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, so I don't subscribe to that. I don't think that deeply into that. But yeah, I saw this topic mentioned on your previous video, and I hate to give our friend Chris K any credit, but he made an exceptional point, I think, with this, especially in best ball formats with Kevin Marks. If Jaret Patterson goes down, yeah, Kevin Marks is the full-time guy with no legitimate backup behind him. So I thought that was a great point, that you can snag Kevin Marks in any format late, and if injury, God forbidding, happens with Jaret Patterson, then you have a league winner right there in Kevin Marks. And if he doesn't, if he just remains as the RB2 for Buffalo, he's still giving you consistent double-digit carries every single game. Even, let's see, last 5 weeks when the coaching staff decided to let Jaret Patterson loose, he was averaging just under 30 carries a game. Kevin Marks in that span was averaging, 17 carries a game. He's still, even when Jaret Patterson went on that run to the last month of the season, Kevin Marks was still getting double-digit carries. So I agree. I think you really want to handcuff these running backs just because of the potential of Kevin Marks. Or if, Jaret Patterson goes down with injury, Kevin Marks is a league winner. We'll see if they have that same workload. I mean, who knows? What if they find a quarterback in Matt Myers or Kyle Van Treese is, second coming of Tyree Jackson? I don't forecast that, but what if that happens? Then, you can see those carries get decreased. So I don't, I think Jaret Patterson, Kevin Marks, I think both solid running backs.
Well, the one thing that we can agree about is that these are the top backs, right? So I think, the one thing that we try not to do is we don't want to waste a lot of time with the obvious ones, right? We want to kind of go into some of the ones where there's a lot of questions. You and I get emails all the time. Where are the questions? Where are the differences? It comes down to opportunity. We were talking about handcuffing. One player that I'll kind of highlight on that I've been really high so far up until this point going into the season is Kennedy Brooks at Oklahoma. I know that you and I have gotten a little bit of conversation about Kennedy Brooks. I really like Brooks. I think with the combination of Stevenson being suspended at the beginning of the year, I'm assuming that's going to hold true. We don't have Jalen Hurts or Kyler Murray at quarterback now. We've got Spencer Rattler, maybe obviously a less mobile quarterback, even though he's still going to be mobile. I just think right now the opportunity, particularly early on in the 2020 season, is really too great for Kennedy Brooks to pass on him in some of these drafts that I've seen where Kennedy Brooks, I think I got him in the first draft, and I got him, didn't even get him at my desired spot. I was like, okay, that's enough. He slipped far enough. I've got to take him. I love the beginning, the first half of the season potential with Kennedy Brooks. I think you and I are a little different with Kennedy Brooks. I think that I have him higher rated than you, but that would be the reason why I have a player like Kennedy Brooks rated as high as I do, because you and I mentioned we do get graded a lot. We do get judged a lot on what happens in the first half of the year. And so I look at Oklahoma, I look at the opportunity that Kennedy Brooks has early on in the first half of the year, and I see that opportunity that's presented with it, and I can't see where he doesn't take advantage of that. Now, with that being said, he's going to probably sprain an ankle 2 weeks before the season starts because I've gone ahead and pumped him up. But Do you have any type of players like that on your radar where you're just, you're a little bit higher for a particular reason, given the opportunity? Or
Yeah. So Roderick Thompson from Texas Tech is definitely someone that I'm pretty sure have higher than almost everybody at the running back position. Can you name offhand the backup for Texas Tech at running back? Because I can't. It's going to be some 3-star true freshman. Texas Tech typically likes to use 2 running backs in the historical precedents under David Yost, but can't name who the backup is at this point. So,
well, remember going into last year, they had Tayzon Henry and they brought in Armand Shine from Utah as a graduate transfer. So there was a 3-headed monster. We were really unsure what was going to go there last year. But go ahead, finish your point about Thompson.
Well, I was going to say they don't have that depth this year, unless this, whoever incoming freshman, or if they add a transfer via the portal, they don't have that kind of depth this year. So I see Thompson getting that full workload. He proved last year that he's a fantastic pass catcher out of the backfield. I don't have his specific numbers up right now, but
he caught 39 passes last year.
Yep. And I'm sure Henry dipped into those totals a little bit. I love Thompson this year. I think he's going to thrive in that offense. I think he's another big boy. It's, 200 plus pounds. So he's getting plenty of red zone touches. What's not to like with him, especially in PPR formats?
He's one of those players, Mike, that I did not draft in the first draft. And I think you took him I know you took him in the second best ball draft that we did. And I remember kind of you sending you a message. I really love that pick. You and I talk about this all the time. So Roderick Thompson was a player that I actually projected out a lot higher than where I have him ranked. I think initially when I projected him, I think I had him a top 12 running back. I've got him ranked at 19. I think I had him projected numbers-wise closer to the top 10 because of the point that you just made. Who is the clear number 2 over there? I don't even know if there is one. He caught 39 passes last year. RJ Turner, who was a grad transfer from UL Monroe, led the team, I believe, with 45 last year. Now, I do think, we're going to see a receiver catch more than 50 passes this year at Tech, but your point's well taken. I think you're going to see Thompson 35 plus, maybe even 40 plus from a receptions point this year, playing in the Big 12, playing with a defense that isn't particularly, they're not playing well. They're going to have to play from behind. So I think that's really a good name that you threw out there, given the system and given the opportunity that he's certainly going to have.
Yep. One other guy that I wanted to highlight, and let me pull it up here, was, and this is another guy that initially I wasn't as high on because he didn't have that great of a year last year, but Larry Roundtree from Missouri with the new head coaching staff and Eli Drinkwitz. That's another kind of App State type system where they will favor the running backs, and they have questions at quarterback. They are going to lean on Larry Roundtree, in my opinion. Their RB1 has averaged 253 carries in the last 6 years.
Yeah.
So if I think he had injury issues last year. If he remains healthy, he's going to be, they have Tyler Beatty, but he's more of a pass catcher as opposed to a runner, in my opinion. So I think they could lean on Larry Roundtree. You got the SEC schedule, pretty light to start the year, but I think 253 carries in the first 6 seasons, or in the last 6 seasons from your RB1, that's a lot of that's a heavy workload.
I'm with you there. I think Roundtree, if the stars align, has potential to have a really big season. You're probably looking at 200 plus carries if he stays healthy. You do have a new coaching staff coming in. You are starting with 2 offensive linemen, building off of last year. So you got to sort of rebuild the line a little bit. But if all of the stars align, the system, like you said, is certainly there for a big year for Larry Roundtree. I mean, I feel like we could spend a lot of time on the running back, so I really don't want to rush it. I know a player that
you want to get to Justin Henderson.
We're going to get to him, but Elijah Mitchell too. I'm really high on Elijah Mitchell. I think you and I have I think there's a difference in rankings between those 2 players. So I'll go ahead and just start with him before we get into a few of the other ones. I really love Louisiana Lafayette this year. I love that offense. We know that they lost one of their 3 running backs. They were sort of a 3-headed monster last year, but Mitchell really is sort of their lead back. He had 198 carries, so he almost had 200 carries, 16 touchdowns last year, and 10 receptions. The reason why I like him this year is the one thing that I noticed this past year that I'm hoping regain some steam going into 2020. He didn't catch as many balls out of the backfield last year as he did in 2019. I do think we're going to see him maybe used a little bit more in the passing game, closer to what we saw in 2018 and not 2019. So, and I do think we're going to, I mean, UL Monroe is going to be, them and App State are probably the top two teams in that conference. So the one thing that has happened is UL Monroe has been dominant on the ground, running the ball. And I think the fact that they have a lot of their pieces back in the backfield, you got Lewis back, they've got Regis back, they've got Mitchell back. I just really like what UL Monroe has in play. UL Lafayette has in place. They've got at least 3 starters coming back on the offensive line. That's a team that I really like, particularly in that conference. And I think Mitchell's going to be one of those guys that we're going to look back this year and we're going to see that consistency really played on his side. And he's been consistent in his 2 years at UL Lafayette.
Yeah, I like the point you made about him becoming more involved in the passing game like he was in 2018, because Levi Lewis did start to come on there, especially late in the year. So I think that passing game should be improved. So yeah, that should bode.
And that's one of those players where I look at, and we're going to kind of get ready and go into this because we start looking at upside when we get into running backs. You and I talk about this all the time. There's so much depth at running back, and I'm going to share. I created some graphics just for this show to kind of get into that. But let's kind of go there, because I know that this is one thing that we've talked about quite a bit, is sort of depth at the position. Given what we've seen in drafts, given what we've seen in just what we've participated in mocks or best ball drafts, what's your take on the running back spot? 15 through 30, 20 through 40. What are you seeing? What do you have in your rankings? What can you kind of throw out there for advice for players looking at, or for fantasy owners looking at players that in these tiers?
There is depth throughout the entire draft. No matter how many rounds your draft is, like, you can get a rock solid running back regardless of the round. The top 4 is in, Chuba Hubbard's in his own tier. Then you got the next couple guys, Patterson, Gainwell, and Etienne in that second tier. But just the depth. I mean, I think you've mentioned it in a previous video. You're in the last few rounds, you're looking at guys still in your top, 50, 60, guys with major upsides. Amir White going late, Jashawn Corbin going late. Andrew Clare is a 1,000-yard running back, and he's not even being drafted at this point. So the amount of depth at the position, I personally I haven't been targeting running back near the top of the draft, first round, second round, because I'm getting such good value, I feel like, because of the depth later on in the draft. So I'm targeting quarterbacks and wide receivers early. That's me personally. Depends on the scoring settings of whatever league you're part of. But because of that depth at the position, I've been waiting on running backs this year.
And so I think you and I are in agreement on that. I think there's so much depth when you get past the top tier, essentially, is what you're saying, right? I mean, the top tier guys are in a tier of their own. So you go out and you get those guys early, and then from there you can kind of let the draft fall to you. Because, and here's another point too, I mentioned earlier in the show when we were talking about splitting hairs. You've got a group of guys there between 15 and 30, 25 and 40, where you've got 15 guys who essentially, in all likelihood, based on any type of a projection or ranking, are probably a half a point per week different. And so go with the guys that you like. Don't go with the guys that you're going to have a headache pulling for on a Saturday because they play for your alma mater's rival, right? So go for the guys that you really like. But, Mike, one thing that you and I were talking about, and I've kind of shared this with you, because I remember taking some screenshots and showing you I was going to get my guy Spencer Brown in the last best ball draft that we did. I'm probably higher on Spencer Brown than you. I'm probably higher on Spencer Brown than everybody we participated in a best ball draft with. But the one point that I made to you before earlier, just after the drafts, is that, given the rosters that we were given, the last draft we did was a 16-man roster. We're going as many as 26 in these best ball drafts. And For me to get a guy late in the draft that is probably a 1,000-yard rusher, double-digit touchdown guy is really hard for me to pass on late, because I feel, given depth and given, these rosters, the way that we build them, if I have a chance to get a 1,000-yard rusher and a double-digit touchdown guy as possibly 40 as my fourth running back, I think I'm going to go ahead and jump at that, because I think it gives you a lot of consistency at a position like a flex for a league that's, particularly in best ball leagues, that, you're playing out all year. You don't know what you're going to get. And I think I mentioned this to you. Spencer Brown may only show up in my best ball lineup 3 times this year, but he's so darn consistent. He could be there every week just because he pops up at a flex position. So what I did, and I think really what this is going to do, and let me know if you see the screen. I'll let you know when I pop it up. But I think it's really going to highlight some of the points that you and I talk about as far as depth at the position between even like 15 and 40. So let me share my screen. And of course, I'm going to admit not being too tech savvy, but I'm going to see if I can go ahead and find this graphic here, Mike. So let me see if I can get the right. Let's see.
Yeah, Justin Henderson also locked up in the queue, I see.
Yeah, you see that, huh? Okay. Let me see if I have it. Spencer Brown.
There you go.
This is it. Okay. You got it?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the graphic that I want to share with a lot of people, because I think this really sheds some light on what we're talking about. So I'm going to try to slow down a little bit and take a minute to explain this graphic. When we look at the bottom, we're looking at Spencer Brown's 17 and 18 seasons, the workload that he got. There's no guarantee he's going to get that this year, but I would have to assume, based on where I have him ranked, that we're going to see a healthy Spencer Brown. We're also looking at a UAB offensive line that returns 4 starters and is possibly going to be, they're going to be one of the favorites in that conference. So let's just throw that out there. I think their defense is going to be good too. We can get into that later. But this is something I want to share. If you look all the way at the right, Mike, that shows my preseason rankings on some of these guys. What I tried to do in this graphic was highlight guys that may be similar to Spencer Brown in utilization. High volume rushing guys that aren't particularly used a lot in the passing game. Because for the reasons that we mentioned, we like Sir Roderick Thompson at Texas Tech, was because we really love the involvement and what he's going to give us in the passing game. But these guys don't give us much at the passing game. So let's take a look at what some of these high volume rushers did last year. Xavier Valladay at Wyoming, 1,265 yards. He actually added 211 on 11 catches in the passing game. That's unusually high. That we're going to say that might not happen, even though we think he can give us more in the rushing game this year, because he only scored 5 rushing touchdowns last year. But anybody can pause this graphic when they get to it. But I think what we're doing is we're really just highlighting high volume guys that don't give us a lot in the passing game, and see what their fantasy points per game average is, or what it was last year, compared to what Spencer Brown did, similar style, what he did in 2017 and in 2018. And when you look at his 2018 season, his 17.8 fantasy points per game average was right below Josh Johnson, who was actually the best running back on this list from last year. So we've got Spencer Brown ranked at 40. We've got Valladay at 21, Hawkins at 10, Kovac at 31, Huntley at 22, Knox at 26, Josh Johnson at 39 this year, Spencer Brown at 40. This plays into the point that I have been driving home, and you've mentioned as well. There are a lot of guys ranked anywhere from, say, 15 to 40. When you look at the fantasy points per game, really, in my opinion, the only thing that's going to keep Spencer Brown from averaging 15 fantasy points per game this year would be as if he has another injury, because of what he's proven to do in his first 2 years there before the injury, and what we get from high volume rushers and what we compare him to. So for me, to get Spencer Brown as a running back 3 or a flex option as a running back 4, to me, is incredible value at that particular point in which I'm drafting him when you're comparing him to some of the other guys that we're drafting.
So a couple things. That graphic made me realize that there are definitely running backs that I tend to avoid because I don't have any shares of Xavier Valade. I don't have any shares of Spencer Brown. I don't have any shares of Javian Hawkins. While you brought up a great point in terms of consistency, I tend to prefer guys that produce in the passing game. I know you have some stats on this, probably on your guide. People tend to play in PPR formats more than non-PPR. Is that correct? Accurate?
Yeah, I would think half point PPR, it's split. I would think it's more, but you're right. There are more leagues that play in some type of PPR format than non-PPR.
I am in 100% agreement with you in terms of consistency. Javian Hawkins, Xavier Valade, Spencer Brown, those guys are going to give you, 15 plus fantasy points each week. Where I tend to stray with Spencer Brown, and this is what makes it tough without any spring, because a lot of what we're talking about right now is hypothetical, right? We have some coaching quotes and stuff like that, but these guys didn't get a lot of practice in. I don't foresee Spencer Brown having 200 plus carries this season. I like the depth that they have at the position. Jermaine Brown, a sophomore, I think can give them kind of a thunder and lightning type duo. 100% agreement that you've got 5 starters returning on the offensive line. UAB's likely to be ahead in a lot of their games especially once they get into the conference or in the CUSA schedule. So yeah, they could absolutely lean on the running game in the second half. I personally project them to use their backups more and preserve Spencer Brown. But again, I'm making a guess here at this point because, we don't have a lot of practice reps and stuff like that to make a better projection on.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. I mean, look, if you told me Spencer Brown can give me Elijah Mitchell numbers from last year, 198 carries and 16 touchdowns, I'll take that as he's going to be the goal line guy. We do know that. So whether or not they have thunder and lightning, I can definitely see that. I really like UAB this year. I think they're going to be really good. And so I just think if Spencer Brown's healthy, the one thing that I like about teams that are good, whether it's the Elijah Mitchells, whether it's the Spencer Browns, particularly teams that play in those conferences, is that if they get ahead, the greater likelihood they are going to ground pound the ball. And what that usually means for some of these running backs, particularly the bigger backs, is it probably means an extra 3 to 5 carries per game, just because they're trying to run some clock there late in the third, early fourth quarter before these subs start coming in. So that's the reason why I like guys like that.
And if you like Spencer Brown, which you do, then you are getting him late and at a great value. And if he does get over 200 plus carries, then you're golden at that point.
Now, are there any guys that right now that you have hired, that you just absolutely love? You kind of ranked them high. I mean, obviously we mentioned Justin Henderson. We're going to get there. I'm going to kind of, turn the floor over to you for this one. Some players that you really love, players that maybe, you maybe come out in your rankings a little higher than where your projections were showing. One or two names you want to throw out.
Yeah, Thompson fits that mold. I mentioned him previously. Jamar Jefferson at Oregon State. I think you're in, year 3 of that system. The backup from last year, Artavis Pierce, no longer there. He's graduated. So I think the bulk of the carries are going to go to Jamar Jefferson there. He's shown to be a pass catcher. I think he's got 20-plus receptions in at least one of his seasons. So I have him at RB10. I like him a lot. We'll see if, we were just talking about it with UAB. Is Oregon State going to be ahead in many games in the Pac-12? Probably not. Maybe they'll surprise. I do like a lot of their offensive talent, but how are they going to lean on the ground game in the second half like we just discussed with UAB? Probably not. So Jefferson, I think, has got a lot of all-around ability. Like I said, I like guys that can catch the ball out of the backfield, and he's proven that. Let's see, George Holani, I think I might be higher on than some. Me and you have probably said this at exhaust. The previous history of Boise State running backs, you're going to get 1,000-yard. What are they on? Season 10, 12? I don't know, of producing 1,000-yard backs. George Holani entering his second year. I think he put on weight this offseason, so he should be able to handle more of a workload. Again, another guy that's proven to be a good pass catcher out of the backfield. I like George Holani as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good one too, because the history of Boise State. He's one that I am a little nervous on. Boise State has that 1,000-yard rushing streak going. Had they not made the conference championship game last year, or the only reason Holani got to that 1,000 yards is because of those extra great games. But you know what they did? They snuck it out. I think Holani may have had some ball control issues last year. So let's hope that those are taken care of, because we know that they're going to have depth at the running back position. But I am with you on that, and I like Jamar Jefferson too. I think that's a good name to throw out there, because the one thing that we talk about these heavy volume rushers, but teams like Texas Tech and teams like Oregon State are going to have to throw the ball deep in games. And so to have those running backs that can catch the ball out of the backfield, that's what makes those guys incredibly valuable in college fantasy football, particularly because they're going to be in there most of the game, Mike, whether they're playing from ahead or whether they're playing from behind. Jefferson, Thompson, those guys are going to stay in there as long as they're healthy. So, the one guy that I wanted to focus on a little bit before we kind of move down the line in regards to some sleepers of some guys that we stay away, because I feel like we can stay here all night with the running back, is sort of Justin Henderson over at Louisiana Tech. I know last year he kind of came on the scene. He had a really great stretch there in the middle of the season where he was scoring at least one, sometimes two touchdowns a week. The one thing the reason why I have him really high is I really like, historically, and I say this a lot with certain coaches, I really like that what some coaches do when they find the guy that's really their guy, and has proven to be their guy. Something Holtz has not had in a lot of his history, his 15 years of coaching. He's had a lot of running backs, and I did a little research on this, where a lot of his leading rushers, he didn't get many of them back the following year. He's done it a lot with some one-hit wonders. But it wasn't the case. That hasn't happened a couple of times, and I'm going to share a graphic with everybody. But I do like, and we talked about pass catchers. Henderson proved to catch the ball out of the backfield last year. He caught 24 passes, and let's be honest, he really wasn't even a starter for the first 3 weeks of the season. So when you look at Justin Henderson's numbers, you almost have to prorate the first 3 weeks out of the equation and see what he averaged per game those last few, minus the first 3 games. Also, you have to keep in mind this as well. Jamar Smith, if you remember back, was suspended for 2 games last year. And in those 2 games, they played with the backup quarterbacks for 2 games. They lost both games. I think they lost at UAB, and I forget who the other road game was. They lost both of those games. It probably cost them a spot in the CUSA championship. They wound up losing that spot to Southern Miss because of Jamar Smith's suspension. And so really at that particular point, Justin Henderson was everything that the defense had to focus on. So I almost throw those 2 games out of the equation. But let me get into a little bit of why I like Justin Henderson. I may spend a little too much time on him, but he's one guy that I really wanted to highlight, because when I look at the history of Skip Holtz, he hasn't really changed a lot in his 15 years. He really does like to ride his running back one. The problem is that over the course of, and I'm just going to use Louisiana Tech as an example. He's been at Louisiana Tech from 2013 to 2019. 2013 was sort of a transition year because he was going from Sonny Dykes. So Sonny Dykes to Skip Holtz is a huge transition, right? So we're going to kind of take that 13 year and throw it out. But 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019, he's given his number one running back 15 carries a game at least 8 times in all but one of those seasons. But you have to remember, Mike, if you think about our college fantasy football days, Israel Tucker, Jacquez Dancy, Cameron McKnight. I mean, he's used a lot of rotation, but whenever the running back one started that particular week, Tucker went over 15-plus carries in 2018 twice. Dancy did it 5 times. McKnight did it once. My thing is that he's just never had a chance to identify a running back one in the majority of his seasons, and a lot of his returning running backs have never come back, but he's had a handful. Here's the graphic. I'm going to share this with you. In Holtz's 15 seasons as a head coach, and I'm probably getting everybody lost in the weeds on this, right? He's only had 4 running backs in those 15 years that has carried the ball at least 15 times a game, 8 times in a single season. In other words, at least 8 games these guys were fed the rock 15 plus times. I'm going to share that graphic right now. Let me see if I can pull this up. Here we go.
We're going deep here.
Yeah, this goes back to his ECU days, but it also stays here at Louisiana Tech. These are the only guys. These are the guys that Holtz has had as a workhorse back in his coaching career. And you look at those rushing numbers. These guys have gotten at least 15 carries a game 8 times in a single season, and look at their final numbers. The only one that you can really dispute is Dominic Lindsay, who only had 6 rushing touchdowns in 2009, but he even finished at 15.4 fantasy points per game.
Have you ever heard of that name since that season?
No.
So he clearly
but I
wasn't.
think everyone's heard of Chris Johnson, though, right?
Yeah. See, but you see what can be produced from a no-namer like Dominique Lindsay. 15 points a game, you will take that all day.
That's right. So when you look at Tech with Kenneth Dixon, he finally had a back come back for him, and Kenneth Dixon was able to duplicate in 2015 what he did in 2014. Well, look what Justin Henderson did in 2019. And so for me, if you take Justin Henderson's first 3 games out, right? Look at his last 10 games. So his fantasy points per game, he averaged 21.3 points per game. Huge jump. He averaged 18 for the season if you consider the first 3. But if you just take those 3 out, he averaged 20-plus points, fantasy points per game. He comes back this year, and I really think Louisiana Tech's offense rides them. Here are just a couple of other side notes on the Louisiana Tech offense under Skip Holtz. I said we were going to throw away 2013 as a transition year from Sonny Dykes. Look at 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, Mike. They've averaged 26.5 rushing touchdowns per season under Holtz. Who's going to score a majority of those touchdowns? Justin Henderson, right? Look at his running back 1 receptions by year after you throw out that transition year. 30, 33, 42, 20, 16. Last year, Justin Henderson, 24. I think we're going to see a heavy dose of Justin Henderson. I think Tech's going to be really good. They're going to score a lot of rushing touchdowns. I think a majority of those are going to be Justin Henderson. I think he's going to catch at least another 24 passes out of the backfield this year. And I think we're going to be looking at Justin Henderson in this graphic once again heading into next year as we do going into this year. And so I just really wanted to kind of highlight Justin Henderson for me, who I have as a top 10 back, because we said this. We draft guys based on their ceiling, their potential. And that's why I like Henderson as much.
I agree. The ceiling that he has is there, and I have him at RB11, so I'm in agreement with you. You might be higher on him, I believe, but I have him as a top 15 back. I like him. When he finds his back, as you said, Skip Holtz typically rides him. Israel Tucker, I believe, is the backup. Not anything noteworthy where he's going to really dip into those carries, I don't believe. Justin Henderson should add to his pass catching totals, I believe.
Yep.
One concern that I have that you mentioned is when Jamar Smith was suspended for those 2 games, the defense is kind of keyed in on Justin Henderson. What do we expect with Aaron Allen at quarterback? We saw him play that 1 or 2 games where Jamar Smith was suspended. Underwhelming, I would say. So, could he take a step forward? Sure, and kind of balance out that offense, but absolutely. But we don't know what to expect this year out of the quarterback position, which is really my only hesitation this year with Henderson.
I agree with you on that, and it could be a plus in Justin Henderson's point too. Why? He could get more dump-offs out of the backfield because of Allen's inability to read the defenses down the field. So we'll see how that plays out. That's why I really like Henderson, and I'm really high on him. I rank players according to their upside, and so that's why I have Henderson that high. Let's kind of have the fun now. Some names that you're staying away from at the running back spot right now. You got a couple of names out there where players you're seeing drafted like, oh, I'd never go for them right there, or guys that, like I mentioned with Charlie Brewer with the injury concern, that maybe it's just a red flag for you. Too much risk to draft where they're being taken right now.
Yeah, we actually saw prime examples of this in our mock draft last week. I think it was one person that selected both of these players. Nakia Watson from Wisconsin. I know everybody loves the system, and who doesn't love that system? I am just steering clear of his ADP right now because I don't see the upside when I watch him play. I think he could easily be a 1,010 guy, kind of like Spencer Brown, but I don't see a Jonathan Taylor type season coming from him. They have pretty good depth with Garrett Groshek. Some people still like Julius Davis, the redshirt freshman. I particularly like Jalen Berger, the incoming freshman. I think he can maybe even be a guy that takes over later in the year. I'm not sure if that happened with Jonathan Taylor his freshman year. I don't recall, but I don't see the upside right now with Nakia Watson, so I am steering clear of drafting him. The other guy that I'm seeing drafted highly is Jerome Ford, the Alabama transfer who's now with Cincinnati. People, I think, like the new name, right? The new shiny object that a team has, and people just want to take him just because he's that new and shiny toy to play with, right? Don't forget that Jared Dokes is still there, and he will be the starter if he remains healthy, which is, of course, his red flag is health, because he's been injured each of the last 2 seasons. But, I read a recent article from 247 Sports that said Jared Dokes is going to be the guy if he's healthy. He's similar stature to Michael Warren, the previous starter, 230 pounds plus. So he's going to get those goal line carries. He's proven that he can at least catch the ball out of the backfield. From what I've read, Jerome Ford will be the backup to start, and they could utilize him in the Wildcat formation. That's kind of what they did with Michael Warren. But I've seen Jerome Ford drafted very high before Dokes, and I don't understand that.
I'm with you. I'm on board. You and I have talked about this. I am a big Jared Dokes guy. I probably need to have him ranked a little bit higher. I think just the presence of Ford keeps him down for me. But you know what? Where I have him ranked, he's still available. People are getting him super late because I think the new shiny penny, like you said, is the guy that's getting drafted. I think for the most reason, this is what I have in the preseason fantasy draft guide. I think people forget this, but in 2017, Dokes led the team as a freshman in rushing. He was hurt the following year, and that's when Warren took over in 18 and 19. It was hard to not keep Warren the starter because of how well he played. But last year, when you look at Dokes' numbers and you actually calculate his fantasy points per touch, I think they were actually better, if not the same as Warren, or very similar. You've got a proven running back. He's going to provide leadership in the locker room because I believe he's a senior this year. He knows the system. I don't see, and Cincinnati's going to be pretty darn good. I don't see how Dokes doesn't open up as a starter. He's going to get every opportunity to succeed in that offense because let's be honest, Ford left Alabama because there was no playing time for him. He's going to have all the playing time in the world after 2020. The backfield is going to be his. I just don't think it's going to be his exclusively in 2020. So I am on board with you with Dokes. I'm glad you brought that name up because that's definitely a player that you and I have kind of gone back and forth on.
Yeah, and I'm not saying I'm projecting Jared Dokes to have a Michael Warren type season. I think it's clear that there is going to be a rotation of sorts between Dokes and Ford, and Charles McClelland is a pretty good pass catcher out of the backfield. So I think they're going to use all 3 backs.
Yep.
People selecting Ford so high and ahead of Dokes makes very little sense to me.
I'm with you. I have Dokes ranked higher than Ford. I have Ford down there at the bottom just so people don't forget about him because in best ball leagues, I'd be handcuffing these guys.
Exactly.
I'm with you on Watson. I have Watson ranked 17, which is probably going to be higher than you. I rank him based on just his upside and his ceiling because if he does emerge as running back 1 and somebody has to, you would think eventually the potential is too great to ignore for too long. But I'm also on board with the theory that there could be 4 guys in Wisconsin that get some carries this year. You can't rule out Groshek from even being a red zone monster. You know he's going to get catches. He's going to be the third down back. There's Berger, there's Davis, and I even think there's another guy coming back from injury that provides depth at the position too. There are a lot of players that can get time in that Wisconsin backfield early on, because you have to remember, before Jonathan Taylor emerged, we didn't really know about Jonathan Taylor until he actually played. And so I do think that Watson, for me, is going a little earlier than I would get. He's ranked 17, but I have to say, for me to get him at running back 2 might be, as my second running back, might be a stretch. However, given his upside, I would take him as a running back 3 for the reasons that we mentioned. And there's 2. His upside, if he nails down the starting position, and chances are there's so much depth behind him in the draft after anyway, as long as you do a solid job drafting depth, you can take the risk with Watson. But let's be honest, everybody thinks they have solid depth. Who doesn't like their team after a draft day, right? So, the one thing that you and I talked about this guy, the one player that I'm a little hesitant to be too high on, you might be higher on him than I have, but he's going off the board way earlier than I project. And that's David Bailey at Boston College. I do have a little concern. Look, Adazio's not there. It's not the same system. I don't want people to fall into the trap that David Bailey is going to be the next coming of A.J. Dillon in that offense. I don't know if we're going to see maybe a thunder and lightning in that offense this year. I don't know how things are going to shake out at Boston College. But the one thing that I think, Mike, you and I can agree on, Boston College is probably going to throw the ball a little bit more than they have in years past under Adazio. How that affects David Bailey, and how that affects David Bailey, who I believe is like a 240, 245, 50-pound back.
He's a big boy.
Yeah, he's a big guy. So I don't know if that offense is going to be geared towards him to get the 25 or 30 touches per week that sometimes A.J. Dillon was getting on a week-to-week basis.
Yep. I have him at RB25. So, you like a guy, but it's all about where they're being drafted. And I don't have the ADP in front of them. I like David Bailey. I like him more actually than Nakia Watson, just because, I think we saw last year that David Bailey can be very productive. He proved that last year, even as the backup. They may throw it a little bit more. I don't think they would probably throw it a lot more if Phil Yurkovich, the Notre Dame transfer, is eligible. It's all about, you like a guy, but I'm not going to reach for David Bailey thinking that he's going to become the second coming of A.J. Dillon, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I don't like to stay too much time on players that we stay away from, because there's just so many players we do love, right? The problem with some of these drafts is that there are just not enough roster spots for us. There's so many players that we love. So let's go through some names, maybe in the middle to late tiers, that you are really exceptionally high on, that you think have been getting overlooked in some of the drafts that we've done so far.
One guy that I noticed this in my UCLA write-up, and I'm not advocating even drafting him in a redraft format right now, but Britton Brown, the Duke transfer, I am starting to see some, quote unquote tea leaves that if potentially Demetric Felton remains in that utility type role that he succeeded in so well last year, that Britton Brown is, a 210 plus pound back who could emerge as possibly that lead role. So I still have Felton. I like what I saw from Felton last year. I think he's going to be the RB1. That's just a late sleeper that I've started to read upon, that they're expecting Brown to have heavy involvement in the offense this year, and Chip Kelly will ride his running backs. So I like Britton Brown as kind of a late flyer type. One guy also that I recently wrote about was Gary Brightwell from Arizona, right? We haven't seen a lot of him because J.J. Taylor has been the starter, but J.J. Taylor averaged 14 points a game, fantasy points a game in the last 2 years, and Brightwell is going to assume that RB1 role. Haven't seen him selected in any draft that we've done to this point, and that's another guy that's just kind of floating out there in that 50 to 60 range that could have some high upside.
Yeah, I think a few names that I'll kind of throw off that the one thing I like to do in some of these drafts that we do, Mike, and I've shared this with you, is I kind of like putting the guys onto the radar. I'm never the guy that when we analyze the drafts, am getting any articles written on me that I've got the best team, because I tend to stay with the guys that we don't know yet, that are unproven. And because I go with the unproven guys, I don't necessarily get great draft grades, but there are a few names out there that I do really like this year. Because if we're talking upside, which is where I rank players and how I like guys, there are some that I really like. I think it's hard not to like Destin Coates at Georgia State this year, right? I mean, given what we saw that offense produce last year, it's hard not to ride Coates as running back one in that offense this year. I've got him ranked at 23. I've got so other names I'll throw out there. I think Jalen Bester right now is getting a little bit slept on. I think last year he was looked at more as a guy that kind of got the ball around the goal line. But the more I look at Bester, I like his stature. I like the way that they utilized him. I really like what Miami of Ohio has coming back on the offensive line. I think they might be one of those teams that return a bulk of their starters. Yeah, they returned four starters up front. They won the conference championship last year. I do think Jalen Bester is getting slept on a little bit. I love TJ McDaniel, SMU. I've drafted him in both best ball drafts. They've had Freeman and Xavier Jones both move on. We know that they're going to throw the ball around, but we know that they're going to run the ball too. Someone has to replace those carries. I think it's going to be TJ McDaniel. This guy was recruited by Oregon and Clemson, I believe. I mean, he chose SMU over some of those schools, probably because he'd get more playing time, but the path is cleared for him. I think you'll be. It hasn't.
No, I was going to say
yet.
let's. I just want to comment on TJ McDaniel just a little bit. I know you are higher on him than I am, and I say that I have him at running back 40. So like we think highly of this guy.
And I got him at 41, so you actually have him ranked a little higher than me.
There goes my argument.
For him a little earlier.
Yeah, it's the more I dig into it, it's at ranking will likely change throughout the offseason. Name that I've read about on The Athletic, I believe, Ulysses Bentley the fourth. And of course, if you're a fourth, then you're a big deal, right? They've mentioned him as a possibly, again, a 1-2 kind of punch there. He's a burner, so he's not as thickly built as TJ McDaniel, but he's kind of a jitterbug type running back. I think that they're gonna use them in a kind of 1A 1B type tandem. So
which makes sense, because look, I have McDaniel ranked at 41, you have him at 40, so we're kind of lock in step right there. I think that I've been going him earlier than the ranking to make sure, for two reasons. One, that I get him because I like him, because I like the upside, right? So let's be honest. He's more than likely not going to get the Xavier Jones workload that Jones got last year. But if he gets anywhere close to that as a running back 1A, then the value to get him at the 40 spot as a flex option, to me, is great. So that's where I like him. So I'm not trying to hype him into the top 20, but I have him there at 40, and that's definitely on the radar right there.
So, I mean, last year they ran Xavier Jones 244 times, right? We wouldn't consider Kamon Freeman a 1B, and he got 122 carries. So there's a lot of vacated production. So that's, I think, why you are high on TJ McDaniel. And apparently I'm higher on him than you are.
Well, the vacated production plays into the same theory that we were talking about with Kobe Lewis at Central Michigan, right? Who we have ranked in the top 5. And so I think the reason why TJ McDaniel is not higher ranked for me is just because of the unproven.
Yep.
Unproven commodity. But you're right. There's so much vacated production. Somebody has to take that. And I right now feel that McDaniel's going to get a bulk of that vacated production.
Yeah, I agree with you. I guess that's just a name to throw out that I've seen that's kind of emerged as Ulysses Bentley the fourth, maybe as a possible second option in that offense.
No doubt about that. And then I also think, for me, another interesting name is Trey Harbison, the transfer from NIU going over to Charlotte. I think Charlotte returns Aaron McAllister, right? But we know what Benny LeMay did. I think Harbison came home. He's from the area, so that's a hometown school for him. I think he's proven he can be a workload. That's what he did at NIU. I think he's coming in. I think he's day one starter, and I think we can see numbers that are going to top the 200-yard mark 200 carry mark for Harbison over at Charlotte. And I see him going late in a lot of the drafts that we're doing, Mike. And I think there's incredible value for him as well. And like I said, I've got Harbison at 45. I mean, these guys that we're listing between 20 and 45, there's not much of a difference. It just goes to show that a lot of these fantasy owners really can sit on running back and really get some depth late. I mean, we haven't even gotten into the Cameron Harrises, the Isaiah Bowsers, maybe the John Emerys of LSU, who really can have big years if they stay healthy and they're locked in at running back one. We haven't even gotten to those guys yet, and there's so much depth on the board at running back.
Yep, 100% agree.
Any deep sleepers you want to throw out before we move on? Guys that you have ranked that really aren't getting drafted. Maybe you've got them 70 plus, 80 plus, somewhere in that 100 range that could emerge and be on a roster 2 to 3 weeks into the season.
Well, I kind of highlighted him previously, Britton Brown. Again, if they use Felton similarly to last year, I'm not projecting it. I have Felton as the RB1. But if for some reason they feel best utilize Felton in that utility role, I think Britton Brown is in line for a heavy dose of carries. The other guy that I just noticed this weekend that was listed in 2 magazine publications as a starter is Penny Boone, the freshman at Maryland. Not sure he was even listed in my initial rankings, but both publications listed him as the starter. We like the production that Anthony McFarland gave us and Javon Leak from last year. So that's another name that could be starting to pop up on some drafts upcoming.
Yeah, and I'll throw out a couple too. A name that we've seen move up draft boards recently. I can see him actually moving up in my rankings would be an Eric Gray from Tennessee. Yep. I think Tennessee is going to be much improved. I think they're going to lean on that run game. I believe one of the running backs was it Tim
Jordan? Yep.
I think he got arrested or something. We'll see if he's suspended. I don't know if that's going to open up anything for Eric Gray, but I do like Eric Gray. I said we would see New Mexico State again. I think a good deep late sleeper could be Amari Samuels, the former Michigan guy, right? Who was thrown out of there, lands there. We know you said this system has been in place, and a lot of you guys have been playing college fantasy, or if you have not been playing college fantasy football for the last 5 or 6 years, go back and just Google Larry Rose III and look up his stats, and you'll see what a running back has potential to do at New Mexico State in a schedule that's not really that daunting. He could be one of those guys, and here we go, New Mexico State player. We said we'd see it again. A guy that you and I also touched on, Mike, too, in some of our personal thread is what happens at Stanford with running back? Does a guy like Austin Jones emerge as running back one? Will he lock in? What's going on over at Stanford? David Shaw, he's under the gun right now. And so will we get a revert to the running game? Their assets seem to favor them in the passing game. We'll see. But we know what the history of the Stanford offense has done. We know they're usually big bodies up front. And, given the history of over there with Bryce Love, McCaffrey, there has to be some running back one that has value within that offense over there at Stanford. And so
I compare that a little bit to Wisconsin in the sense that it's a system that has typically produced running backs. The issue is that we've seen Nakia Watson play. I mean, we really haven't seen Austin Jones to this point. I think he got, a handful of carries last year, but not to the extent of Nakia Watson. And we're seeing Austin Jones go undrafted. I haven't seen him been drafted hardly ever. So that's another guy just in the system that if you can get late and hit, you're in a good spot there.
I mean, look, and I'll even throw out a few more for guys. And I know that I'm really just throwing darts, Mike, but this is the fun part for us, right? These small names. I mean, I've got guys like you mentioned Brightwell. I've got Brightwell in the 90s. You've got the top-rated running back in this year's class, Zachary Evans at TCU, where I don't see how he doesn't start. The path is pretty much cleared. I still have him ranked in the 90s. I think a kid like Jacardia Wright at Kansas State in that run-heavy offense has potential to be a name that we're going to see 2 to 3 weeks into the season because all of a sudden he's getting 20 carries in the Kansas State offense. You've got Amir Rasul, who was a graduate transfer from Florida State that landed at Middle Tennessee. To pair with Asha O'Hara in that backfield, there's going to be a lot of running options there. We'll see if O'Hara opens up things in the running game, but he's a name that possibly could be on radars down the line as well. I just feel like there are so many good names. And you mentioned at the top of the show, Andrew Clare not even getting drafted, 1,000-yard potential. He's in my 90s. So there's just so many guys, Mike, that really are just kind of hit or miss. And I think that's really what our rankings show. A lot of the guys that we have, we've given some good quality names after 50. It's a lot of the proven commodities in the top 50 and a lot of the guys that are going to give you consistency, because if you're going to draft a running back, you know, the first 2 or 3 guys, what's one thing that you want? You want consistency with them. And so that's sort of, you can see that reflected in our rankings, I think. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I do. And I think a lot of the purpose of our rankings, like guys are going to formulate their own opinions. They're going to formulate their own rankings. And they use our rankings in the draft. What ours are really, I think the purpose of ours is a baseline, right? We want you to avoid making a critical mistake in a draft, right? A lot of our rankings, and you mentioned it previously, we formulate our projections. Guys are split by decimal points, right? Guys between 25 and 45, just a hair off, really, a point or two in our projections. So find the guys that you like and don't make the critical mistake as, say, what we covered earlier, a Jerome Ford type in round 6 or 7, right? Because it's a mistake at this point.
Yeah, I'm with you. So look, man, I tell you, dude, I'll tell you, time is flying by. I didn't realize we were this far in the show. Let's get to receivers before my computer loses power, right?
Let's do it.
Let's start at the top. We both, I don't really want to waste too much time there because I think we have a lot of I think when you look at our rankings, there's a lot of similarity in the top 10, right? Maybe not necessarily the order: Rondale Moore, Jamar Chase, Marquez Stevenson, Reggie Roberson at SMU, Devontae Smith, Bateman, Surratt, Wallace, Jonathan Adams, Atwell for me at Louisville. I think we're in agreement with most guys, maybe off a few spots here or there, maybe particularly with a guy like Roberson. I know Jonathan Adams maybe is one guy that you wanted to kind of touch on at Arkansas State. Do you have him in the top 10 as well?
I have him at 9, yes, so top 10. I get, and this was a conversation point in another video you did, I get the point of not seeing the upside of, say, Omar Bayless of last year. And so where he's being drafted, I can see not wanting to target Jonathan Adams at this point. But the dude had 62 catches last year as the wide receiver 3, right? He's got talent, and he's got great size, I believe 6'2", right? Of all that vacated production that they have with Merritt and with Bayless gone, like this guy is going to, he's going to get 80-plus catches at a minimum, in my opinion, if not higher, right? And they just got a lot of new pieces on that wide receiver core. Dahu Green, people are hyping him up as a potential breakout candidate. Dude hasn't been healthy his entire career, right, in college. So they got the transfer that you like, Rashad Paul in the slot potentially. Just a lot of new parts in that wide receiver core. I like Jonathan Adams, and I think he proved last year that he can step into that lead role.
You know, what a lot of people don't understand, I think sometimes we have a habit of making a like-for-like comparison. You know, we think that Jonathan Adams is going to be the next Omar Bayless, and that's why guys don't like him. I don't think we're really looking like that. I mean, we're talking like this, we just spoke about the SMU position as well. It's vacated, right? Someone has to take it. Well, somebody's got to take that wide receiver 1 spot at Arkansas State, and he's certainly got the size. He can definitely, he can definitely fill the role. I think what a lot of people don't realize is just how exceptional Omar Bayless's season was last year. This has no bearing on us doing the show. This was not planning on it. This is for a separate project that I was working on, but I just did this morning. It's ironic we're talking about him. I just pulled this number. If you take fantasy points per game, per week from last year's wide receivers, Jamar Chase led all the receivers last year. He averaged 24.32 in half-point PPR leagues. He averaged 24.32 fantasy points per game over all 14 games that he played in last year, because he missed 1 game at the end of the regular season or near the end because of an injury. Omar Bayless was the second best receiver at 24.14. He averaged less than 0.2 of a point per week than Jamar Chase last year. That's how great Omar Bayless was as a fantasy producer. I'll be honest with you, Mike. I don't know about you and how you feel about this, but if Adams can give me 18 to 19 per week, to me, he's worth that early of a selection, because The one thing with wide receivers that we don't get as opposed to running backs is we have trouble getting consistency. And so there's a lot more volatility in the rankings. You'll see our rankings be a lot more fluid throughout the preseason because the news that comes in on certain receivers has a chance to not only jump them up 1 or 2 spots, but maybe put them up 6 to 10 spots. And so you don't have to give me Adams at a 24.14 clip per week for me to make him worth a top 10 wide receiver. Heck, if he gives me 17 to 18 points per week, on an average from a receiver, 18 a week, that's incredible value.
And I think that value is possible with that amount of vacated targets that is gone now with Bayless and Merritt now gone again.
Yeah, and I know that we were gonna spend some time on some receivers and not maybe some particular not identify some particular ones, but maybe look at some of the teams where you've got the USCs, you've got the Oklahomas, you've got the North Carolinas, where there's a lot of nice 1-2 combinations out there. Something that I mentioned to you with wide receiver, and this is something that we can talk about, is I'm a De'Ami Brown over Daz Newsome guy. I think I'm in the minority on this. I was also the Hopkins over Watkins guy several years ago. I like to see those combinations. I really like the big play potential receiver. And for me, when I go into a season and I'm 50-50 like I am on De'Ami Brown and Daz Newsome, for me, I prefer the big play guy as opposed to maybe the slot guy. Because last year, if you look at receivers and you look at consistency, De'Ami Brown he might have only caught 4 to 5 passes per game, but gosh darn, he was going to giving you 70 to 80 yards and a touchdown every single week. And for me, I don't know about how you feel about this, but for me, the hardest thing about a roster on a week-to-week basis in college fantasy football is finding the consistent wide receiver production on a week-to-week basis. I feel like we can go into the waiver wire and find a 1-week gem a lot easier at quarterback and running back than we can at wide receiver. So I really value consistency at the receiver.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, and that's why I have Daz Newsome 5 spots higher than De'Ami Brown. So this is probably why I'm bad for podcasts, is that I don't see there's not a lot of difference between the two. They're both going to get a heavy amount of targets, right? So if you favor Brown over Newsome, I don't have a strong argument for either route that you take, right? So they're both going to be top 20 guys that you're going to get consistent production from. Where I lean Newsome. Go ahead.
And I'm with you. I've got Brown at 14 and Newsome on 15, and I don't feel like I was taking the high road by doing that. I really feel that if Sam Howell is going to be as good, as we think that he's going to be and put up the numbers that he's going to put up, then there's a good chance that Newsome and Brown are going to catch 2/3 of his touchdown passes. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. And so for me, Newsome may have a little bit more. I rank according to half-point PPR. Newsome may be a tad better, tad favored slightly more in a full PPR, whereas I like Brown maybe a tad bit higher because of his scoring potential. And if your league incorporates big play bonuses, that's a favor for Brown too. So I just kind of wanted to touch the Brown and Newsome conversation because I am a Brown over Newsome guy. Receivers, what do you see? And where do you want to go with receivers, Mike?
Well, I think I'd like to target Marquez Stevenson just for a second because you have him as wide receiver 4, I believe. I got quite a few comments.
I have him at 3.
Okay, yes. Yeah, I have him at 2. This is another upside, believing in Dana Holgorsen of the year 2 system. If you look at the wide receiver 1 of those year 2s under Holgorsen, the wide receiver 1 averaged 93, 1,200 plus yards, and 15 touchdowns. And now you add in the fact that Marquez Stevenson is going to be used on the ground in reverses and possibly even in the return game. That upside for me is just too hard to ignore. And since I'm a Clayton Tune believer, I obviously have to be a believer in Marquez Stevenson as well. So I personally like the upside of him this season. That's why I have him as wide receiver 2. Wide receiver 2 overall.
Hey, I'm with you. I'm strong on Stevenson. I love the history of the way that what Holgorsen has done with some receivers, his history of 1,000-yard receivers and receivers with double-digit touchdowns. It's too hard to ignore in that offense that probably has a lot more continuity this year than it did a season ago. What about over at Purdue? Let's go there. I'm going to jump tracks for a little bit because, I have Rondale Moore ranked at 1. I have to tell you, I was, going into my preseason rankings, that one made me a little bit nervous because of David Bell. David Bell is there. David Bell played exceptionally well in Moore's absence last year. But Moore's ability to catch the ball anywhere in the field and get touches anywhere on the field really does it for me, because typically I'm kind of the guy that says Bell's got the bigger size. He's the bigger red zone threat. I favor him more. I do think that will take away slightly from Rondale Moore, but Rondale Moore's utilization all over the field, maybe even in the return game for me, kind of sticks him in that wide receiver 1 spot for me. But I make no mistake about it. Rondale Moore could be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We're probably splitting hairs, but just kind of addressing your thoughts, the Moore versus Bell conversation.
The David Bell presence doesn't really affect where I have Moore. It's more the quarterback situation. They added Austin Burton from UCLA, who I now have projected as the quarterback 1. And I think he had 1 start last year where we saw a little bit, but he doesn't have extensive experience, right? And I was very underwhelmed by the Purdue quarterbacks aside from Elijah Sindelar last year. So the guys that they're bringing back, underwhelming in my opinion. So the presence of David Bell doesn't really impact how I view Rondale Moore. I was just looking back kind of at Western Kentucky. I mean, when they had a quarterback at Western Kentucky, wide receiver 2 averaged 65 receptions a season. The wide receiver 1 averaged 84. So maybe not 84 is not the level that we want from a Rondale Moore. He's obviously capable of getting 100 plus, but the presence of David Bell doesn't really impact how I view Rondale Moore. It's how the quarterback competition will play out, and if somebody can reach the levels of what we've seen from previous ROM quarterbacks.
I think a perfect example in how we can kind of parallel these two is the 2 that we talked about compared to the 2 now. I mean, De'Ami Brown and Daz Newsome, and then you've got Rondale Moore and David Bell. All 4 of those guys are incredibly talented. What's the difference? One's got Sam Howell, and one's got possibly Austin Burton, who I think is probably going to start, because I didn't see anything in Plummer and I didn't see anything in the other quarterbacks to make me think that they were nailed down as the starter. So that's the only thing that, I'm with you, that makes me nervous. But let's be honest, Purdue's probably going to be playing from behind, so they are going to be throwing the ball for 60 minutes, right? I think we could probably agree on that one.
Yep, absolutely.
What about Oklahoma? Let's go there for a second before we go somewhere else. I was incredibly high on Jaden Hazelwood. I took him in our best ball draft. I took him and Weiss. I took them a lot earlier than I had in my rankings because I wanted but one of them, because I thought that one of those 2 guys would eventually be the wide receiver 1. Since then, we've got news that Hazelwood is injured. More than likely, I'm guessing his season will end. If not, we won't see him to the end of the season. There's a lot of Weiss versus Rambo debate going on right now. Let's talk about Oklahoma wide receivers for position. Do you have a preference? Are you staying away? What's your take on that?
I'm not staying away. That would be malpractice to stay away from Oklahoma wide receivers, right? I'm still on the Rambo train, hesitantly, but I'm still on the Rambo train. And these guys are separated from, I got Rambo 29 and Weiss probably somewhere in the 40s. So not a great discrepancy between the 2 in terms of differences. I just personally like what I saw from Rambo last year. I think he has enough ability to be a wide receiver 1 in this offense. I think the Theo Weiss argument is, again, the kind of new shiny object. We saw portion of him last year, but we didn't see a great deal from him. So I know Rambo kind of tailored off late last season, so I think that's probably why you and others are hesitant on him. But I'm gonna stick with the old horse and Rambo as wide receiver 1. But I will say this too, Weiss and Rambo aren't that far apart in my rankings. It's typically been 2 guys for Oklahoma in that passing offense. Now they incorporate the running backs in the passing game. They have H-backs, tight ends, whatever that they get involved. But historical precedent, it's 2 wide receivers that are involved in the passing game. So I think Rambo and Weiss will both be productive this year.
So you said something that I really believe. The more I started looking at Oklahoma receivers with the passing game this year and the receivers, because I was high on Rambo last year. I had Rambo ranked pretty high last year. Made me look good for the first couple of weeks, and then he kind of tapered off. the more I looked at this before the Hazelwood injury, the more I thought we could possibly see Oklahoma with 3 700-plus yard receivers. I really started to feel that we were going to see the distribution all over the field. So I do think that that can still happen with Rambo and with Weiss. I think both of those guys could go for 700. The reason why I prefer Weiss is because I feel that if one is going to become a go-to option, it's more likely Weiss than maybe Rambo, who would be more, in my opinion, of a seams vertical threat guy. And so when I look at the 3rd down and 6, 3rd down and 7, I see where maybe Weiss's upside is a bit more than Rambo. But let's be honest, if you're a fantasy owner of either, you want both of those guys to play well, because the more Weiss plays well, the more Rambo's going to be able to take the top off the defense. And the more Rambo can prove and Rattler can prove that he can throw the ball downfield to Rambo, it makes Weiss that much more dangerous. So maybe Hazelwood's injury becomes a little bit more of a blessing in disguise. I don't wish injury on anybody, but it creates a little bit of clarity for us. Now, there was a lot of talk going into the season. You had Theo Howard coming in from UCLA, but let's remember, I think he blew an Achilles. So that's not going to be something for him to easily come back from. You've got Obi Obialo, who came over from Marshall, who came over from Oklahoma State. So he's at his 3rd program. But Mike, I don't know. I've seen him get some run a little bit. Some people really bringing his name up. But for me, I can kind of see Obialo fitting more in that Lee Morris role, where he's not on the field all the time. Maybe he gets a few, maybe he gets 20-something receptions and he gets 5 or 6 touchdowns. He gets a high percentage rate because he's utilized more in the red zone. I think losing Hazelwood, the one thing that hurt the Oklahoma offense was just losing a little bit of size in the red zone. So I think somebody like Obialo can be a little bit more of a red zone presence. And I think the loss of Hazelwood also, for me, bumped up, and we haven't gotten to it yet. The tight end is maybe somebody like Stogner because of red zone utilization too. But I'm with you. I kind of feel like Weiss, Rambo, I think we're splitting hairs. I think we're looking at 2 guys that can go for 700 plus. But if I'm playing the upside, I think for me, Weiss just has a slightly higher ceiling. But I do think you're right. I think Rambo might actually have the higher floor.
Yep, I 100% agree. I'll admit, I think probably Weiss has the higher upside. I tend to stick with the guy that proved it the previous year, and while he tapered off, I'm still a believer in Rambo. I'm glad you mentioned that Obi Obialo could be that Lee Morris role, because I kind of saw inklings of that earlier this offseason, but I wasn't sure because he played wide receiver at Marshall. So he's not a factor for me in CFF this year, Obialo. I think it's going to be those 2 guys, Weiss and Rambo. And again, you don't like to see injury, but it provided us with some clarity as to who likely.
Yeah, well, before because what most people listening to this or watching this don't realize is that we've been kind of talking about this now for a couple of weeks. And I think when we were talking about this, I don't even think the Justin Ross news had even hit. So I think the Clemson wide receivers now could be a little bit of a discussion point for us. Where are you going at with wide receivers? And I guess I'll start this out since I threw it out there and give you a second to think about it. I was actually incredibly high on Amari Rodgers. I have him as a sleeper going into 2020. This was before the news of Justin Ross even broke. I just felt that last year, what Rodgers did coming back from that ACL injury, I think he came back within about 6 months. He was a factor on the field, and I only see him getting better. And now the loss of Ross kind of creates a little he's not going to fill that role. But I think what he's going to do is he's more of a reliable target now for somebody like Trevor Lawrence, who has other guys on there that maybe just doesn't have the proven track record. I still think I like Nagata. I don't know where you have him ranked, but for me, he would be my top. But I think when I did my rankings, I didn't put him in Justin Ross stratosphere. I think I still have him somewhere around the 30 range. Where do you see the Clemson wide receivers shaking out for yourself?
I think we have them similar range. I have Ngata 37, I believe.
I have him at 36.
Okay, yeah. So we have similar range. I just look back and, Clemson games for me personally are a little boring, so I don't watch a ton of them. I mean, they're blowing out their opponent for the most part, but it's typically been an outside receiver that will lead them in fantasy points, okay? And Rodgers is, I believe, likely to play in the slot, so Ngata for me is going to be the wide receiver one, but in PPR formats, I can see an argument for Amari Rodgers.
He could be the second coming Artava Scott, my man.
There you go. Yeah, see, and it's been a stat, or I remember a stat. I think him and whoever in Hunter Renfrow, they had 2 slot guys a couple of years ago. They combined for over 100 targets. So if the slot guy gets, if it's Rodgers and he's gonna get that many targets, of course he could end up as the wide receiver one. I believe I have him in my projections having the most receptions of the group. But I see the upside with Ngata as the outside receiver.
I'm with you. Give me the guy outside the numbers in the Clemson offense. That's the guy that I really want to have. I just think now with Ross going down, I can see maybe some increased utilization for Amari Rodgers as sort of that utility knife, right? We talk about how Rondale Moore gets used up at Purdue. They can put the ball in his hands at anywhere on the field. Maybe we see that a little bit with Amari Rodgers this year. I'm throwing it out there. I have to get it out. He's a sleeper for me this year. Clemson is too good. And now with the loss of Rodgers, it creates a little bit of a void of touches. Remember, vacated touches is what we've been talking about. And there's no way I could go the show without throwing out Amari Rodgers as a sleeper. And it's kind of, how do you mention a Clemson player as a sleeper? Are any of them really sleepers? But I don't think many people have him on the fantasy radar going into this year. And he could be somebody that becomes a weekly starter, in my opinion. We'll see how that shakes out. But I know, you and I have talked about over the last few weeks about what could happen at Mississippi State, what could happen at Washington State. We know that there are going to be some good, or should be some good fantasy receivers that emerge from these programs. They're not really being targeted much right now in our drafts because we don't have a lot of clarity. I think for the most part, when you look at Washington State and Mississippi State's roster, maybe Osiris Mitchell down at Mississippi State has been the highest guy off the board. Maybe Renard Bell at Washington State. I would say those are the 2 names. Am I wrong? What are you seeing? I know you wanted to kind of chat about the wide receivers at those programs here.
Yeah, Washington State, I think, is more solidified than Mississippi State at the moment. We know the run and shoot typically favors the slot receivers, inside receivers. No doubt. So I think Renard Bell and Travell Harris have those positions on lock, with Tay Martin outside, which, he's been inconsistent over the last few years, but he's the main proven guy outside. So I think those are the top 3 for Washington State. And that will remain that case for me throughout the rest of the offseason. Mississippi State, again, need to dive into it, I think, deeper. Osiris Mitchell is trending downwards for me. I know he was the guy, or he's the only proven guy that's really coming back this year for the Bulldogs. You add in Tyrell Shavers. Malik Heath, I've been told the JUCO transfer is a big time player. I'd have to dig into it deeper. They may even flip. I may even have Malik Heath come in wide receiver 1.
Where do you have Osiris Mitchell right now? Or how high did you have him before you moved him down? Because right now I'm sitting on Osiris Mitchell at 42. I've never had him in my top 40. I just have him at 42 because
he's wide receiver 24 for me now, but that will not remain the case.
Because I think you're right. Washington State, there's a lot more clarity. I think we're going to see that receiver roulette at Mississippi State, like Leach had a history of doing over there at Washington State. It would be nice if we get some guys that get a majority of snaps. I think in the last best ball draft, I took Tyrell Shavers because of the upside. I had Osiris Mitchell and Austin Williams actually as the top 2 at the time. And the only reason I had Williams in there that high was because when I looked at proven depth on the roster, he was the only one that really had any size. Shavers coming in there definitely helps out in that department. And so being a former recruit, Alabama, as we said with Jerome Ford at Cincinnati, just because you wore an Alabama uniform does not mean that you're going to go into a program and play right away. However, a graduate transfer like Shavers going into Mississippi State that has no help at receiver, and he has 2 years of eligibility. I think that really played into the fact that I think Shavers is going to be a starter in that offense. I could be wrong, but I wanted to spend a couple of minutes on the Mississippi State and Washington State offenses because we know that they're going to put up some points, right? We know they're going to put up some yards. Somebody's going to be on the receiving end. We don't have anything set in stone, but we have a pretty good idea, I think, of how it's going to play out. We just don't know what the numbers look like.
And that's, again, and speak to the absence of spring practice. It's a guessing game right now for us. So we use our projections and see kind of where guys slot in and go from there.
Where do you want to go from here as far as audible wise with receivers? We can go almost anywhere. There's really not really anything pressing for me. I can kind of throw some deep sleepers in there. It's hard to kind of say guys that you're staying away from unless there's guys really in the top 10 or 15 that you're not on board with. Where do you want to go with receivers from here? Are there anybody that you're looking to stay away from, or anybody that you're kind of targeting late, or anything that you're seeing, any shakeups, news that you're getting in that's kind of putting guys on your radar?
Let's see. Garrett Wilson, I think I've gotten him now in the last 2 drafts that I've participated in. I believe he's moving into that slot role that KJ Hill played in last year. So, and we saw the upside of him outside last year. I mean, that phenomenal catch that he jumped over at Clemson, defensive back. So I think him moving inside in that slot role, I think he has some big upside, and it's hard to fail in that Ohio State offense. The one guy that I'm trending downwards on, I don't see a lot of upside in Brennan Eagles from Texas. Just athletically, he's a very solid player. I don't know if he has that upside of a Colin Johnson or Devin Duvernay. It's also an interesting talking point. How is the dynamic with Tom Herman and the new offensive coordinator going to shake out? Because we've seen the last few years that the slot receiver for Texas has been the main go-to guy in terms of targets. Does that change with the new offensive coordinator coming from, I believe, Ohio State, who's focused on kind of the outside receiver? How does that dynamic change?
I think that's an interesting point. I think Eagles, for me, I bumped Eagles down with the signing of Tarek Black, and not necessarily because I think Black is going to take over and be lock solid as the number one. I just think there's just more. You talk about spreading the ball around. I'm not sure. You've got Black, you've got Eagles, you've got Smith, we've now Whittington now. I mean, even when you look at running back, I mean, you got Robinson coming in, the freshman. I just feel like it's really set up for Sam Ehlinger to be the lock solid top fantasy option in this offense. And I don't even know where to go for the number 2 option in my book. I don't even have a lot. There's no other Texas player right now that I think I want. I know that there are some that are higher maybe on Smith because of what he can do at the slot. I just don't. For me, it's Sam Ehlinger or bust on the Texas offense.
I agree. Running backs, I do like the running backs. I mean, Keontae Ingram's a good PPR value we didn't even discuss during the running back portion. He's gone relatively undrafted that you can get late, and I think he's going to be the guy back there, even though they have plenty of depth with the incoming freshman and Roshan Johnson in the backfield. I would target him late, but yeah, I have no, wide receiver. You like to project based on what we've seen in the past, but it speaks to your point that we don't really know any proven commodities right now with the Texas offense. So it's tough for us to project because it's not always what we've seen in the past, right? Devin Duvernay and Lil Jordan Humphrey succeeded in the slot, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Like, there's not going to be necessarily one guy there this year. Jordan Whittington and Jake Smith in the slot, there's going to be split targets between them. So, yeah, I'm with you. The Texas offense, outside of Sam Ehlinger and maybe Keontae Ingram late, a lot of question marks right now.
What about any other wide receivers you want to highlight, target, talk about? There's a couple that I'll mention real quick that I'd like to highlight. I mentioned earlier when we were doing quarterbacks about 5 hours ago that I really like Bo Nix. And I think if you like Bo Nix and you like the history of Chad Morris's number 1 receivers, you have to be really high. I'm super high on Seth Williams at Auburn this year. And I think when you look at the offensive coordinator now at Penn State, who came over, that's pretty much been everywhere with Fleck, has really produced a bunch of 1,000-yard receivers. I think Dotson over at Penn State should be getting some looks. I think he's going at about the right time. I think his value right now in the drafts that we're doing right now, I think he's going maybe a little bit lower than where I have him ranked. I actually have him ranked Where do I have Dotson? I have Seth Williams up at 22, and I've got Dotson. Um, Heck, I don't even see him on. I got him at 27, so he's top 30 for me. I think he's probably going in that range, maybe a little bit lower. But those are two guys sort of in the 20 range that I think wide receiver you can get as a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 that could potentially have high ceilings for you this year in 2020. Any names like that you want to throw out?
Yeah, there was one that I made a switch in my rankings that I wanted to highlight at SMU. I think conventional wisdom was that Rashee Rice was going to be the wide receiver 2. I made a switch moving over to JUCO transfer Danny Gray. Sonny Dykes and the staff have spoke highly of this JUCO transfer. His offer sheet is littered with Power 5 programs, TCU, Baylor, Florida State. I think Auburn was in that mix too. He's going to take over for James Prochet in the slot role, and we saw him lead the nation in targets and receptions, I believe, last season. So I've made that switch. You plug in the highlight reel for him, Danny Gray, and he's just running roughshod over opponents, just breaking away with his track level speed. So that's a guy that I am definitely targeting. He's not even listed on Fantrax right now, so definitely a guy that you can probably get late as a sleeper.
And I'm with you. I wanted to clear the floor to give you that one. That was a guy you put on my radar, so I'm going to give you the credit for that one. And I think also we can't ignore guys like Kevin Austin at Notre Dame, who I think if he takes over that wide receiver 1 role to go with Ian Book, who I think is going to have another solid year. We talk about vacated production. Notre Dame certainly a place where there's vacated production. And then we can't forget the recent signing of Rico Bussey over at Hawaii. I think that presents a big opportunity for that vertical offense. A player like Bussey, who probably had 2 or 3 different offers to go to programs bigger than that. But man, Mike, that might have been the one program where he landed that has the best fantasy potential for him. Good move or not?
Bad move because I have so many Jared Smart shares. No, I think good move. It's going to be I moved Jared Smart down in my rankings. I think, it's going to be a debate in terms of who's the higher ceiling player, who's the higher rated player between Bussey and Jared Smart. In that system, there's been 2 wide receivers that are productive, so high on both. Obviously, I still have Smart in there because the dude had, however, 80-some catches last year, 70 maybe. So he's a proven player. I know Rico Bussey did it at North Texas, but right now Jared Smart is the 1A to Rico Bussey's 1B. That could change at some point here throughout the offseason.
And I've got Bussey ranked ahead of Smart. Obviously, Bussey signing did drop Smart for me, and I'll throw in one late one here. And you could throw on anyone that you want as well, because I feel like wide receivers, you can kind of get lost down in a black hole with receivers. But if you like Tune as much as you do, and you like year 2 at Houston under Dana Holgerson's program's year 2, then I don't even think you could sleep on somebody like maybe Keith Corbin as a late flyer in some of these drafts where I don't think Corbin's been drafted in any of the leagues we've done, Mike.
If you want to look back at that year 2 trend, wide receiver 2 is 75 receptions, 964 yards, and 8 touchdowns. So I'm glad you brought that name up because, again, that's a good spot to be in for a Dana Holgerson year 2 system.
Now let's bring it down the stretch here. We're coming down to the finish line. Tight ends, defenses, and those positions they call kickers. I dare say the K word. We're not going to go there. We're not really going to go defenses, but let's spend a couple of minutes on tight ends. I'm going to give you the floor on tight ends. What are you seeing? What are you expecting? You see a lot of your leagues come in, a lot of questions for tight ends. What are some names that are kind of jockeying for position on your draft board? What do you see? I have a few takes for some of my tight ends. I'll give you the floor for a few minutes on tight end.
Yeah, I have a similar impression with tight ends as with the running back 2 through 4 argument between Etienne, Gainwell, and Patterson. Among the top 4 tight ends for me, Granson, Keithy, Pitts, and Kohler, I don't have a strong take as to who you want to select between those 4. That's tier 1 in itself for me, and you pick the guy that you feel best. Outside of that, there's a small drop-off, but I have a couple of under-the-radar guys I have at 5 and 6. Xavier Gaines for Marshall. There's a stat that Marshall and Florida Atlantic were the only 2 teams last year in college football that had 2 tight ends with 50-plus targets each. Okay, so now their tight end 1 from last year is gone, and you have Xavier Gaines stepping into that tight end 1 role, and he had 50+ targets last year, already a proven guy. A
He
similar
had
argument.
181 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns as well.
There you go. I know you're going to talk about the Utah tight end used in a similar fashion. So Gaines has been used as a wildcat quarterback. He might have been a converted quarterback. He might have been a quarterback at some point during his Marshall career, but that's a guy that I'm targeting. I have him as tight end 5 right now. So the other tight end that I wanted to spotlight was Quentin Morris from Bowling Green. I got him in our last draft that we completed. It depends on how your league designates him in terms of position. If they're going to list him as a wide receiver only, he's not going to be a factor in college fantasy football. If you have him as a wide receiver / tight end or a tight end only, he's going to give you 50+ catches and however many touchdowns. I think I have him projected at 5 or 6 maybe. So that's top 10 worthy production for a tight end, and he's going relatively undrafted. So those are 2 guys I wanted to spotlight.
Yeah, I feel like I can just kind of give this a brief rundown. I think I've mentioned this on some previous shows, and you played into it, Keithy, over at Utah with Zach Moss gone. He scored 3 rushing touchdowns last year, vacated production once again. We know that Wilmore, who are the running backs, Wilmore and Brumfield, we don't really know who's going to lock down that one. Does that mean somebody like Keithy, who is a little bit proven, can get some more run inside the, near the goal line? Possibly. I think his upside is why I have him at 1. I think Pitts, Cole, or Granson. I think we're all right lockstep with that. Josh Peterson, I am a little worried about him, even though I have him at 5. I do think UL Monroe will have to throw the ball a little bit more. I don't like UL Monroe, the running back, Josh Johnson, as much as I did last year. They were replacing the entire offensive line. We didn't even get into that, but that's kind of a brief bullet point there. I think Brevin Jordan is incredibly talented at Miami. It'll be interesting to see how he gets used in that offense. I have Weidemeyer at Texas A&M ranked high. I know you asked me about him. I just like his proven ability. I like the fact that most of that offense does return. I know they get Baylor Cup back. It'll be interesting with Weidemeyer and Cup now to go with Jamon Osborne if they go to some bigger sets, right? And we see some 2 tight end sets. But I do like Weidemeyer because of his proven ability already. So I do think that kind of gives him a leg up. And do we really know where Baylor Cup stands, how severe his injury was? He missed the entire year. So I just think from a standpoint of what we know, not having spring like you mentioned, I kind of lean on Weidemeyer right now. I have Gaines in the top 10. I have him listed at 9 for just what you mentioned. I mentioned Austin Stogner at Oklahoma. I have him at 13. I mentioned Chase Bryce as a deep sleeper quarterback. We forget that Noah Gray caught 51 passes last year at Duke. You got Trey McKitty at Georgia, with Jamie Newman coming over from Wake Forest at Georgia. Sometimes we forget about who else is coming. They've got the tight end McKitty coming over from Florida State. And then you've got, something you and I have spoken about off air is who takes over as Stanford's top tight end. We know they've got freshmen coming in. Does a guy like Scooter Harrington take over at their tight end position? Notre Dame, notorious known for tight ends, got Tremble. LSU's got the top tight end coming in the country. How does he figure into the offense? So many questions at tight end, but we don't burn too much time there because not a lot of leagues require tight end, but we did just want to take a minute to kind of go over that list. Am I missing anything, Mike, before we kind of close this out?
No, I think just the point that you rattled off a bunch of names there, and you didn't mention a whole bunch of other names. So I don't want to hear any arguments this season that there's not depth at the tight end position. It is strong at the top, and it is deep.
So deep sleeper for me at tight end, Kenny Yeboah, the transfer from Temple who landed down at Ole Miss and now over there with Lane Kiffin in that offense as well. We know how Kiffin used the tight end at FAU, right? So maybe he's somebody that throws on. I don't know if he's been I don't know where he's going in a lot of leagues.
No. I like Daniel Crawford at NIU, of course, NIU grad here. But so him and who's the other tight end they had, Mitchell Brinkman, they both had 30+ catches last season. So now you have Brinkman going to South Florida. That opens up a wealth of targets there for Daniel Crawford at NIU. So there's a wealth of tight ends this year.
One final note, too, on tight ends before we can close out. I think we still have a good tight end that's still available if you're drafting in best ball formats. I know earlier in our April draft, somebody did take a flyer on Rico Bussey when he did not even land at a school, ended up being a good pick. if you've got best ball leagues, expanded formats, a guy like John Rain is still available right now. We haven't heard anything on John Rain, right?
Yep, he transferred to Northwestern, so
Gotcha.
he landed there. And so yeah, they didn't have it last year, but they've had a lot of success with that super back type role. And so Peyton Ramsey, now the quarterback for Northwestern. I think John Rain, I have him at tight end 12. So
there we go. I missed that. I missed the Rain news. Completely missed that.
There's so much news in college fantasy football. We drive each other crazy going through all
That's
the
why
news.
sometimes we cross-check to see. I'll ask you a question about a guy just to make sure that you found
Yep.
out, and you do the same with me. It just happened right here on the show. This is exactly what goes on when Mike and I talk about it in our threads. We can go on, and at some point we kind of have to shut it off, which we're doing right now. And I think we went about 3 hours, Mike. So
yeah, I think my laptop is running out of battery right now.
Well, look, man, before we get out of here, is there anything that you need to promote, get off your chest, anything you want to tease out there before we go? Tell everybody again what you got, where they can go find you, and just give them the goods before we go.
Yep, you can find me on Twitter at M first initial Bainbridge CFF. That's my Twitter handle. You'll see the link to my Patreon page on there. We're continuing to crank out the team previews, which I hope we get out by all 130 from the end of the season. We're going to have some updated rankings coming from my partner, Zach Hall, coming out here in the next week or so. We'll have some Dynasty content at the end of the month. And then I teased yesterday, actually, on the site that we're going to have something new to the site that we're hoping to add by the end of the month that I think everybody will enjoy. So thank you for giving me the platform to promote that. And this was an enjoyable conversation, Joe.
Yeah, man, look, we've been trying to do this forever. It was nice to finally get it done. If you have not checked out Mike's Patreon page, or you're not subscribing to him, you really are missing out. Guy turns out some solid stuff all year round. He's got some solid partners that he does some work with. You're missing out if you're really not into Mike's Patreon. And like I said before, and I'll say it again, the value in Mike and I's site really is our differences. And so I'll say it again, go over to the CFF site. We got the preseason fantasy draft guide, 50 plus pages, PDF format. I mean, guys, you know, from sleepers to schedule analysis, to rankings, to draft day cheat sheets, to draft results, we've got it all for you guys. Go over to the CFFsite.com and check that out. Once again, I'm talking, thanks again for joining us. Once again, my name is Joe DiSalvo, the voice of the CFF site, for myself and my buddy, Mike Bainbridge. Thank you guys for watching. We'll chat soon.